And I'm at the hour. So, ooh, what am I doing here? Strange. Hello to anyone who is here. Presume that anyone is here. Generally there's someone here now, so I'm pretty confident there's probably someone here. But I don't know for certain. And so I'm doing my little uncertainty bit because I don't get to do it very often these days. Normally people say hello. But yeah, hello to anyone who's here. My name, for anyone who's not familiar, is SkitterSkreetch. And I am a small rat in a big library. Why am I here again? This is again the wrong place. Strange. But yeah, as you can see, small me, big library. And for anyone who's unfamiliar, I read books in this library for you at the behest of that lamp what you can see in the top rightmost corner. For reasons that are fairly complicated to go into. Anyhow, what are we doing then? So today I am going to be reading something. Oh, where am I? Oh yeah, that's right. I'm going to be reading not these ones. This one here, The Outsider by Albert Camus, which I just got Lamp decided I was going to do this one because I couldn't read yesterday, and he stepped in for me because I said I would read, and so let's call it. He decided that I would have to read this one today because it was. It's culturally important. Oh, hello, Ade. Good to have you. I'm just doing my little introductory thing where I waffle on for a little while because I'm pretending that I'm not sure if anyone's there while I give people a chance to come here and be here, you see. It's the meta narrative. Thanks, Abby. Hoping this will go well. Looking forward to this one, actually. Yeah. Been a while since I don't know if I've ever read any Camus, but it's been a while since we've done any philosophy stuff. But yeah, this one should hopefully go a couple of hours. And yeah, of course, everyone is always welcome to ask me to repeat stuff, chat, etc. Or if you just want to lurk, I always appreciate that too. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else to say really, but I don't think there is. So, yeah. I feel like there was something to say. I feel like I had an announcement, but I can't remember what it is. Oh, I've done some changes to the emotes, that was it. I don't know if all of them will have gone through yet, because Twitch does not trust me to upload everything without checking it first, but there is a new... I got rid of the Artak emote because I don't think anyone has ever used it ever. And then I uploaded a new version of the lamp emote that is an animated one. And then because of that, I changed the lamp emote that was already there to be a little bit more. Oh yeah, it has gone through. So yeah, so there is let's go change lamp emote, and there is a new emote in place of the Artak emote, and then there is a new animated emote for the two people who are subscribed to me. None of whom I think are here, but if they do turn up or watch the VOD, they'll know. But yeah, and very interestingly, I drew one of these emotes. The new, free emote was one that I myself, the rat, drew. Not I myself as the team or Lamp and all us. So that's fun. But yeah, I think that's what I had to say. But yeah, Lamp is yelling at me. So without further ado, I suppose, I shall be pressing on with The Outsider by Albert Camus. I'm interested in this one because I've heard of Camus in the sense that while I was rummaging through this library a while back, I found a newspaper that said he'd won the Nobel Prize in 1957, which was when this place was closed down. So he is the most relevant and significant author of this place, I suspect. So yeah, we'll see how we get on. The Outsider. Part 1. Mother died today. Or maybe yesterday, I can't be sure. The telegram from the home says, your mother passed away, funeral tomorrow, deep sympathy. Which leaves the matter doubtful. It could have been yesterday. The home for aged persons is at Marengo, some 50 miles from Algiers. With a 2 o'clock bus I should get there well before nightfall. Then I can spend the night there, keeping the usual vigil beside the body, and be back here by tomorrow evening. I've fixed it up with my employer for 2 days' leave, obviously under the circumstances. He couldn't refuse. Still, I had an idea he looked annoyed, and I said, without thinking, sorry sir, but it's not my fault, you know. Afterwards it struck me I needn't have said that. I had no reason to excuse myself. He rapped the window to express his sympathy and so forth. Probably he would do so the day after tomorrow, when he sees me in black. For the present, it's almost as if Mother weren't really dead. The funeral will bring it home to me, to put an official seal on it, so to speak. I took the 2 o'clock bus. It was a blazing hot afternoon. I'd lunched, as usual, at Celeste's restaurant. Everyone most kind, and Celeste said to me, "There's no one like a mother." When I left, they come with me to the door. It was something of a rush getting away, as at the last moment I had to call at Emmanuel's place to borrow his black tie and mourning band. He lost his uncle a few months ago. I had to run to catch the bus. I suppose it was my hurrying like that, or with the glare off the road and from the scar, the reek of petrol and the jolts that made me feel so drowsy. Anyhow, I slept most of the way. When I woke, I was leaning up against a soldier. He grinned and asked me if I'd come from a long way off, and I just nodded to cut things short. I wasn't in a mood for talking. The home is a little over a mile away from the village. I went there on foot. He asked to be allowed to see Mother at once, but the door porter told me I must see the warden first. He wasn't free and I had to wait a bit. The porter chatted with me while I waited, then he led me to the office. The warden was a very small man, with grey hair, and the Legion of Honour rose out in his buttonhole. He gave me a long look with his watery blue eyes, and we shook hands, and he held mine so long that I began to feel embarrassed. After that he consulted a register on his table and said, "Madame Merceau entered the home 3 years ago. She had no private means and depended entirely on you." I had a feeling he was blaming me for something, and started to explain, but he cut me short. "There's no need to excuse yourself, my boy. I've looked up the record, and obviously you weren't in a position to see that she was properly cared for. She needed someone to be with her all the time, and young men in jobs like yours don't get too much pay. In any case, she was much happier in the home." I said, "Yes, sir, I'm sure of that." Then he added, "She had good friends here, you know, old folks like herself, and one gets on better with people of one's own generation. You're much too young, you couldn't have been much of a companion for her." That was so. When we lived together, Mother always watching me, but we hardly ever talked. During her first few weeks at the home, she used to cry a good deal. That were only because she hadn't settled down. After a month or two, she'd have cried if she'd been told to leave the house, because this too wouldn't have been a wrench. That was why, during the last year, I seldom went to see her. Also, it would have meant losing my Sunday, not to mention the fag of going on the bus, getting my ticket, and spending 2 hours on the journey each way. The warden went on talking, but I didn't pay much attention. Finally he said, "Now I suppose you'd like to see your mother." I rose without replying, and he led the way to the door. As we were going down the stairs, he explained, "I had the body moved to our little mortuary, so as not to upset the other old people, you understand. Every time there's a death here, they're in a nervous state for 2 or 3 days, which means, of course, extra work and worry for the staff." We crossed the courtyard where there were a number of old men talking among themselves in little groups. They fell silent as we come up with them. Then, behind our backs, the chattering began again. Their voices reminded me of parakeets in a cage, only the sound wasn't quite so shrill. The warden stopped outside the entrance to a small, low building. "So here I leave you, Monsieur Merceau. If you want me for anything, you'll find me in my office. We propose to have the funeral tomorrow morning. It will enable you to spend the night beside your mother's coffin, as no doubt you would wish to do. And just one more thing. I gathered from your mother's friends that she wished to be buried with the rites at the church. I've made arrangements for this, but I thought I should let you know." I thanked him. So far as I knew, my mother, though not a professed atheist, had never given a thought to religion in her life. I entered the mortuary. It was a bright, spotlessly clean room, with whitewashed walls and a big skylight. The furniture consisted of some chairs and trestles. 2 of the latter stood open in the centre of the room, and the coffin rested on them. The lid were in place, but the screws had been given only a few turns, and their nickeled heads stuck out above the wood, which was stained dark walnut. An Arab woman, a nurse I supposed, was sitting beside her bier. She was wearing a blue smock and had a rather gaudy scarf wound around her hair. Just then the porter come up behind me. He'd evidently been running, as he were a little out of breath. "We put the lid on, but I was told to unscrew it when you came, so that you could see her." While he were going up the coffin, I told him not to trouble. "Eh, what's that?" he exclaimed. "You don't want me to?" "No," I said. He put back the screwdriver in his pocket and stared at me. I realised then that I shouldn't have said no, and it had made me rather embarrassed. After eyeing me for some moment, he asked, "Why not?" But he didn't sound reproachful. He simply wanted to know. "I really couldn't say," I answered. He began twiddling his white moustache. Then, without looking at me, he said gently, I understand. You were a pleasant-looking man, with blue eyes and ruddy cheeks. He drew up a chair for me near the coffin and seated himself just beyond. The nurse got up and moved towards the door. As she was going by, the porter whispered in my ear, "It's a tumour she has, the poor thing." I looked at her more carefully, and I noticed that she had a bandage around her head, just below the eyes. It lay quite flat across the bridge of her nose, and one saw hardly anything of her face except the strip of whiteness. As soon as she had gone, the porter rose. "Now I'll leave you to yourself." I don't know whether I made some gesture, but instead of going, he ought to be behind my chair. The sensation of someone posted at my back made me uncomfortable. The sun was getting low, and the whole room was flooded with a pleasant mellow light. 2 hornets were buzzing overhead against the skylight. I was so sleepy I could hardly keep my eyes open. Without looking round, I asked the porter how long he'd been at the home. 5 years, the answer came, so pat that one could have thought he'd been expecting my question. That started him off, and he became quite chatty. If anyone had told him 10 years ago that he'd end his day as a door porter at the home at Moringa, he'd never have believed it. He was 64, he said, and hailed from Paris. When he said that, I broke in without thinking. "You don't come from here." I remember then that before taking me to the warden, he told me something about Mother. He'd said she'd have to be buried mighty quickly because of the eating of these parts, especially down in the plain. At Paris, they keep the body for 3 days, sometimes 4. After that, he mentioned that he'd spent the best part of his life in Paris and could never manage to forget it. "Here," he said, "things have to go off with a rush, like you've hardly got time to get used to the idea someone's dead before you're hailed off to the funeral." "That's enough," his wife put in. "You didn't ought to say such things to the poor young gentleman." The young fellow blushed and began to apologise. I told him it was quite all right. As a matter of fact, I found it rather interesting what he'd been telling me. I hadn't thought of that before. Now, he went on to say that he'd entered the home as an ordinary inmate, but he was still quite hale and hearty, so when the porter's job fell vacant, he offered to take it on. I pointed out that, even so, he was really an inmate like the others, but he wouldn't hear of it. He were an official like. I'd been struck before that by his habit of saying they, or less often them old folks, and referring to inmates no older than himself. Still, I could see his point of view. As door porter, he had a certain standing and some authority over the rest of them. Just then the nurse returned. Night of all, and very quickly all of a sudden, it seemed. The sky went black above the skylight. The porter switched on the lamps, and I was almost blinded by the blaze of light. He suggested I should go to the rectory for dinner, but I wasn't hungry. Then he proposed bringing me a mug of café au lait. As I am very fond of café au lait, I said thanks, and a few minutes later he came back with a tray. I drank the coffee, and then I wanted a cigarette, but I wasn't sure if I should smoke under the circumstances, in Mother's presence. I thought it over. Really, it didn't seem to matter, so I offered the porter a cigarette, and we both smoked. After a while, he started talking again. "You know, your mother's friends will be coming soon to keep vigil with you beside the body. We always have a vigil here when anyone dies. I better go get some chairs and a pot of black coffee." The glare from the white walls were making my eyes smart, and I asked him if he couldn't turn off one of the lamps. "Nothing doing," he said. They had arranged the lights like that. Either one had them on or none at all. After that, I didn't pay much more attention to him. He went away, he brought some chairs and set them out round the coffee. On one he placed a coffee pot and 10 or a dozen cups, and he sat down facing me, on the far side of Mother. The nurse was on the other end of the room, with her back to me. I couldn't see what she would do, but with the way her arms moved, I guessed that she would knit him. I was feeling very comfortable. The coffee had warmed me up, and through the open door came scents of flowers and breaths of cool night air. I think I dozed off for a while. I was awakened by an odd rustling in my ears. After having had my eyes closed, I had a feeling the light had grown even stronger than before. There weren't a trace of shadow anywhere, and every object, each curve or angle, scored its outline on one's eyes. The old people, Mother's friends, were coming in. I counted 10 in all, gliding almost soundlessly through the bleak white glare. None of the chairs creaked when they sat down. Never in my life had I seen anyone so clearly as I saw these people. Not a detail of their clothes or features escaped me. And yet I couldn't hear them, and it was hard to believe they really existed. Nearly all the women wore aprons, and the strings drawn tight around their waists made their big stomachs bulge still more. I never yet noticed what big paunches old women usually have. Most of the men, however, were as thin as rakes, and they all carried sticks. What struck me most about their faces was that one couldn't see their eyes, only a dull glow and a sort of nest of wrinkles. On sitting down, they looked at me and wagged their heads awkwardly, sucking their lips in between their toothless gums. I couldn't decide if they were greeting me and trying to say something, or if it were due to some infirmity of age. I inclined to think they were greeting me, after their fashion, but it had a queer effect, seeing all those old fellows grouped round the porter, solemnly eyeing me, and dandling their heads from side to side. For a moment I had an absurd impression that they had come to sit in judgment on me. A few minutes later, one of the women started weeping. She were in the second row, and I couldn't see her face because of another woman in front. At regular intervals she emitted a little choking sob, one in the feeling she would never stop. The others didn't seem to notice. They sat in silence, slumped in their chairs, staring at the coffin or their walking sticks, or any other object just in front of them, and never took their eyes off it. And still the woman sobbed. I was rather surprised, as I didn't know who she was. I wanted her to stop crying, but dared not speak to her. After a while the porter bent towards her and whispered in her ear, but she merely shook her head, mumbled something I couldn't catch, and went on sobbing as steadily as before. The porter got up and moved his chair beside mine. At first he kept silent, then, without looking at me, explained. She was devoted to your mother. She said your mother was her only friend in the world, and now she's all alone. He had nothing to say, and the silence lasted quite a while. Presently the woman's sighs and sobs became less frequent, and after blowing her nose and snuffing for some minutes, she too fell silent. I'd ceased feeling sleepy, but I was very tired, and my legs were aching badly, and now I realised that the silence of these people were telling on my nerves. The only sound were a rather queer one. It came at longish intervals, and at first I was puzzled by it. However, after listening attentively, I guessed what it were. The old men were sucking at the insides of their cheeks, and this caused the odd wheezing noise that had mystified me. They were so much absorbed in their thoughts that they didn't know what they were up to. I even had an impression that the dead body in their midst meant nothing to them at all. But now I suspect that I was mistaken about this. We all drank the coffee, which one of the porters handed round. After that I can't remember much. Somehow the night went by. I can recall only one moment. I had opened my eyes and I saw the old men sleeping, hunched up on their chairs with one exception. Resting his chin in his hands, clasped round his stick, he was staring hard at me, as if he had been waiting for me to wake. Then I fell asleep again. I woke up after a bit because the ache of my legs had developed into a sort of cramp. There was a glimmer of dawn above the skylight. A minute or two later, one of the old men woke up and coughed repeatedly. He spat into a big check handkerchief, and each time he spat it sounded as if he was retching. He struck the others, and the porter told them it was time to make a move. They all got up at once. Their faces was ashen grey after the long, uneasy vigil. To my surprise, each of them shook hands with me, as though the night together, in which we hadn't exchanged a word, had created a kind of intimacy between us. I was quite done in. The porter took me to his room, and I tidied myself a bit. He gave me some more white coffee, and it seemed to do me good. When I went out, the sun were up, and the sky mottled red above the hills between Marengo and the sea. A morning breeze was blowing, and it had a pleasant salty tang. There was the promise of a very fine day. I hadn't been in the country for ages, and I caught myself thinking what an agreeable walk I might have had if I hadn't been for Mother. As it were, I waited in the courtyard under a plane tree. I sniffed the smells of cool earth, and I found I wasn't sleepy anymore. Then I thought of the other fellows in the office. This hour they'd be getting up, preparing to go to work. For me, this was always the worst hour of the day. I went on thinking like this for 10 minutes or so. Then the sound of a bell inside the building attracted my attention. I could see movement behind the windows, and all were calm again. The sun had risen a little higher, and was beginning to warm my feet. The porter came across the yard and said the warden wished to see me. I went to his office and he got me to sign some document. I noticed that he was in black, with pinstripe trousers. He picked up the telephone receiver and looked at me. The undertaker's men arrived some minutes ago, and they will be going into the mortuary to screw down the coffin. Shall I tell them to wait, for you to have a last glimpse of your mother? No, I replied. He spoke on the receiver, lowering his voice. That's all right, Figure. Tell the men to go there now. He then informed me that we were going to attend the burial, the funeral, and I thanked him. Sitting down behind the desk, he crossed his short legs and leant back. Beside the nurse on duty, he told me he and I would be the only mourners at the funeral. It was a rule of the home that the inmates shouldn't attend funerals. There were no objection to letting some of them sit up beside the coffin the night before. It is for their own sakes, he explained, to spare their feelings. But in this particular instance, I've given permission for an old friend of your mother's to come with us. His name is Thomas Perez. The warden smiled. It's a rather touching little story in its way. He and your mother had become almost inseparable. The other old people used to tease Perez about having a fiancée. When are you going to marry her, they'd ask. He'd turn it with a laugh. It was a standing joke, in fact, so you can guess he feels very badly about your mother's death. I thought I couldn't decently refuse them permission to attend the funeral, but on a medical officer's advice, I forbade them to sit up beside the body last night. For some time we stayed without speaking, and the warden got up and went to the window. Presently he said, here's the padre from Marengo. He's a bit ahead of time. He warned me that it would take us a good 3/4 of an hour walking to the church, which were in the village. Then we went downstairs. The priests were waiting just outside the mortuary door. With them were 2 acolytes, one of whom had a censer. The priest was stooping over him, adjusting the length of the silver chain on which it hung. When he saw us, he straightened up and said a few words to me, addressing me as my son. Then he led the way into the mortuary. I noticed at once the 4 men in black were standing behind the coffin, and the screws in the lid had now been driven home. At the same moment I heard the warden remark that their hearse had arrived, and the priest started his prayers. Then everybody made a move. Holding a strip of black cloth, the 4 men approached the coffin, while the priest, the boys, and myself filed out. A lady I hadn't seen before was standing by the door. This is Monsieur Murad, the warden said to her. I didn't catch her name, but I gathered she were a nurse and sister attached to the home. When I were introduced, she bowed, with a trace of a smile on her long, gaunt face. We stood aside from the doorway to let the coffin bar, and, following the bearers down a corridor, we came to the front entrance, where a nurse were waiting. Oblong, glossy, varnished black all over, it vaguely reminded me of the pen trays in the office. Beside the hearse stood a quaintly dressed little man, whose duty it was, I understood, to supervise the funeral as a sort of master of ceremonies. Near him, looking constrained, almost bashful, were old Mr. Perez, my mother's special friend. He wore a soft felt hat with a pudding basin crown and a very wide brim. He whisked it off the moment the coffin emerged from the doorway. Trousers that concertinaed on his shoes, a black tie much too small for his eye, a white double collar. Under a bulbous, pimply nose, his lips were trembling. But what caught my attention most was his ears, pendulous scarlet ears, that showed up like blobs of sealing wax on the pallor of his cheeks, and were framed in wisps of silky white hair. The undertaker's factotum shepherded us to our places, with the priest in front of the hearse, and the 4 men in back on each side of it. The warden and myself come next, and bringing up the rear, old Perez and the nurse. The sky were already a blaze of light, and the air stoking up rapidly. I felt the first waves of heat lapping my back, and my dark suit made things worse. I couldn't imagine why we waited so long for getting underway. Old Perez, who had put on his hat, took it off again. I had turned slightly in his direction and were looking at him when the warden started telling me more about him. I remember his saying that the old Perez and my mother used often to have a longish stroll together in the cool of the evening Sometimes they went afar of the village, accompanied by a nurse, of course. I looked at the countryside, at the long lines of cypresses sloping up towards the skyline and the hills, the hot red soil dappled with vivid greens, and here and there a lonely house sharply outlined against the light. And I could understand Mother's feelings. Evenings in these parts must be a sort of mournful solace. Now, in the full glare of morning sun, with everything shimmering in the heat haze, there was something inhuman, discouraging about this landscape. At last we made a move. Only then I noticed Perez had a slight limp. The old chap steadily lost ground as the hearse gained speed. One of the men beside it too fell back and drew level with me. I was surprised to see how quickly the sun was climbing up in the sky, and just then it struck me that for quite a while the air had been throbbing with the hum of insects and the rustle of grass warming up. Sweat was trickling down my face. As I had no hat, I tried to fan myself with my handkerchief. The undertaker's man turned to me and said something that I didn't catch. At the same time he wiped the crown of his head with the handkerchief that he held in his left hand, while with his right he tilted up his hat. I asked him what he'd said. He pointed upwards. Sun's pretty bad today, isn't it? Yeah, I said. After a while he asked, is it your mother we're burying? Yes, I said again. What was her age? Well, she was getting on. As a matter of fact, I didn't know exactly how old she was. After that, he kept silent. Looking back, I saw Perez limping along some 50 yards beyond. He was swinging his big felt hat at arm's length, trying to make the pace. I also had a look at the warden. He was walking with carefully measured steps, economising every gesture. Beads of perspiration glistened on his forehead, but he didn't wipe them off. I had an impression that our little procession were moving slightly faster. Wherever I looked, I saw the same sun-drenched countryside, and the sky was so dazzling that I dared not raise my eyes. Presently we struck a patch of freshly tarred road. A shimmer of heat played over it, and one's feet squelched at each step, leaving bright black gashes. In front, the coachman's glossy black hat looked like a lump of the same sticky substance, poised above the earth. It gave one a queer, dreamlike impression, that bluey-white glare overhead and all this blackness around one. The sleek black of the earth, the dull black of the men's clothes, and the silvery black gashes in the road. And then there were the smells of hot leather and horse dung from the earth, veined with whiffs of incense smoke. What with these and the hangover from the poor man's night's sleep, I found my eyes and thoughts growing blurred. I looked back again. Perez seemed very far away now, almost hidden by the heat haze. Then abruptly he disappeared altogether. After puzzling over it for a bit, I guessed that he had turned off the road into the fields. Then I noticed there were a bend on the road a little way ahead. Obviously Perez, who knew the district well, had taken a shortcut so as to catch up. He rejoined us soon after we were round the bend, then began to lose ground again. He took another shortcut and met us again farther on. In fact, this happened several times during the next half hour. But soon I lost interest in his movements. My temples were throbbing, and I could hardly drag myself along. After that, everything went with a rush, and also with such precision and matter-of-factness that I remember hardly any details, except that when we were on the outskirts of the village, the nurse said something to me. Her voice took me by surprise. It didn't match her face at all. It was musical and slightly tremulous. What she said was, "If one goes too slowly, there's a risk of a heat stroke. But if one goes too fast, one perspires, and the cold air in the church gives one a chill." I saw her point. Either way, one was for it. Some other memories of the funeral were stuck in my mind. The old boy's face, for instance, when he caught up to us for the last time just outside the village. His eyes were streaming with tears of exhaustion or distress, or both together. But because of the wrinkles, they couldn't flow down. They spread out, crisscrossed, and formed a sort of glaze over the old worn face. And I can remember that look of the church, the villagers in the street, the red geraniums on the graves. Perez's fainting fit, he crumpled up like a rag doll, the tawny red earth pattering on Mother's coffin, the bits of white roots mixed up with it. Then more people, voices, the wait outside of a cafe for the bus, the rumble of the engine, and my little thrill of pleasure when we entered the first brightly lit streets of Algiers. And I pictured myself going straight to bed and sleeping 12 hours at a stretch. End of chapter 1. I think I'll do my commentary at the end of this one. Feels rude doing that. Chapter 2. On waking, I understood why my employer had looked rather glum when I asked for my 2 days off. It was Saturday today. I hadn't thought of this at the time, only it struck me when I was getting out of bed. Obviously, it had seen that it would mean my getting 4 days holiday straight off, and one couldn't expect him to like that. Still, for one thing, it wasn't my fault if Mother were buried yesterday and not today. And then again, I'd have had my Saturday and Sunday off in any case. But naturally, this didn't prevent me from seeing my employer's point. Getting up were an effort, as I'd been really exhausted by the previous day's experience. While shaving, I wondered how to spend the morning, and decided that a swim would do me good. So I took the tram that goes down the harbour. It was quite like old times. A lot of young people were in the swimming pool, among them Marie Cardona, who used to be a typist at the office. I was rather keen on her in those days, and I fancy she liked me too, but she was with us so short a time that nothing come of it. While I were helping her to climb onto her raft, I let my hand stray over her breasts, and she lay flat on the raft while I trod water. After a moment she turned and looked at me. Her hair were over her eyes, and she was laughing. I clambered up onto the raft beside her. The air was pleasantly warm, and half jokingly I let my head sink back upon her lap. She didn't seem to mind, so I let her stay there. I had the scar full in my eyes, all blue and gold, and I could feel Maria's stomach rising and falling gently under my head. We must have stayed a good half hour on the raft, both of us half asleep. When the sun got too hot, she dived off and I followed. I caught her up, put my arm around her waist, and we swam side by side. She was still laughing. While we were drying ourselves on the edge of the swimming pool, she said, "I'm browner than you." I asked her if she'd come to the cinema with me that evening. She laughed again and said, "Yes, if I'd take her to the comic," and said, "Yes, if I'd take her to the comic everyone were talking about, the one with Fernando in it." When we had dressed, she stared at my black tie and asked if I were in mourning. I explained that my mother had died. "When?" she asked, and I said, "Yesterday." She made no remark, though I thought she shrank away a little. I was just going to explain to her that it wasn't my fault, but I checked myself, as I remembered having said the same thing to my employer, and realising then it sounded rather foolish. Still, foolish or not, somehow one can't help feeling a bit guilty, I suppose, about things like that. Anyhow, by the evening Mary had forgotten all about it. The film was funny in parts, but much of it downright stupid. She pressed her leg against mine while we were in the picture house, and I was fondling her breast. Towards the end of the show I kissed her, but rather clumsily. Afterwards she come back with me to my place. When I woke up, Mary had gone. She told me her aunt expected her first thing in the morning. I remembered it was a Sunday, and that put me off. I've never cared for Sundays, so I turned my head and lazily sniffed the smell of brine that Marie's head had left on the pillow. I slept until 10. After that I stayed in bed till noon, smoking cigarettes. I decided not to lunch at Celeste's restaurant, as I usually did. They'd be sure to pester me with questions, and I dislike being questioned. So I fried some eggs and ate them off the pan. I did without bread, as there wasn't any left, and I couldn't be bothered going down to buy it. After lunch I felt at a loose end, and roamed about the little flat. It suited us well enough when Mother were with me. "Hey Naska, doing pretty well." "Doing pretty well, yeah. What are we doing? So yeah, we're doing the Camus today. There's not going to be a lot of commentary on this one because it's just the sort of text you want to read through, but we're just into chapter 2. Narrator has, he found that his mother had died, went to the funeral, and sort of drearily experienced the existence of it, while showing a very little attachment to his mother. And then he's just come back to the city of Algiers where he lives, spent his Saturday sort of relaxing, gone on a date with a woman whom he was acquainted with and spent the night with her, and then woken up and potted around all Sunday not doing much of anything, which is where we're at now. After lunch I felt at a loose end and roamed around the little flat. It suited us well enough when Mother were with me, but now I was by myself. It was too large. I'd moved the dining table into my bedroom. That now the only room I used. It had all the furniture I needed. A brass bedstead, a dressing table, some cane chairs whose seats had more or less caved in, a wardrobe with a tarnished mirror. The rest of the flat were never used, so I didn't trouble to look after it. A bit later, for want of anything to do, I picked up an old newspaper that was lying on the floor and read it. There was an advertisement for Crucian salts, and I cut it out and pasted it into one album where I kept things that amused me in the papers. Then I washed my hands and, as a last recourse, went out onto the balcony. My bedroom overlooks the main street of our district. Though it was a fine afternoon, the paving blocks were black and glistening. What few people were about seemed in an absurd hurry. First of all, there came a family going for their Sunday afternoon walk. 2 small boys in sailor suits with short trousers hardly down to their knees, and looking rather uneasy in their Sunday best. Then a little girl with a big pink bow and black patent leather shoes. Behind them were their mother, an enormously fat woman in a brown silk dress, and their father, a dapper little man whom I knew by sight. He had a straw hat, a walking stick, and a butterfly tie. Seeing him beside his wife, I understood why people said he come of a good family and had married beneath him. Next come a group of young fellows, the local bloods, with sleek oiled hair, red ties, coats cut very tight at the waist, braided pockets, and big square-toed shoes. I guess they were going to one of the big cinemas in the centre of the town. That was why they had started out so early and were hurrying to the tram stop, laughing and talking at the top of their voices. After they had passed, the street gradually emptied. By this time all the matinees must have begun, Only a few shopkeepers and cats remained about. Above the sycamores bordering the road, the sky was cloudless, but the light was soft. The tobacconist on the other side of the street brought a chair out on the pavement in front of his door and sat astride it, resting his arms on the back. The trams, which a few minutes before had been crowded, were now almost empty. In the little cafe, Chez Piero, beside the tobacconist, the waiter was sweeping up the sawdust in the empty restaurant. A typical Sunday afternoon. I turned my chair round and seated myself like the tobacconist, as it was more comfortable that way. After smoking a couple of cigarettes, I went back to the room, got a tablet of chocolate and returned to the window to eat it. Soon after, the sky clouded over, and I thought summer storm were coming. However, the clouds gradually lifted. All the same, they had left in the street a sort of threat of rain, which made it darker. I stayed watching the sky for quite a while. At 5, there were a loud clanging of trams. They were coming from the stadium in our suburb where there had been a football match. Even the back platforms were crowded, and people were standing on the steps. Then another tram brought back the teams. I knew they were the players by the little suitcase each man carried. They were bawling out their team song, "Keep the ball rolling, boys." One of them looked up at me and shouted, "We licked 'em!" I waved my hand and called back, "Good work." From now on, there were a steady stream of private cars. The sky had changed again. A reddish glow was spreading up beyond the housetops. As dusk set in, the street grew more crowded. People were returning from their walks, and I noticed a dapper little man with a fat wife amongst the passers-by. Children were whimpering and trailing wearily after their parents. After some minutes, the local cinemas disgorged their audiences. I noticed that the young fellows coming from them were taking longer strides and gesticulating more vigorously than at ordinary times. Doubtless the picture they'd been seeing was of the Wild West variety. Those who had been to the picture houses in the middle of the town came a little later, and looked more sedate, though a few were still laughing. On the whole, however, they seemed languid and exhausted. Some of them remained loitering in the street under my window. A group of girls come by, walking arm in arm. The young men under my window swerved so as to brush against them, and shouted humorous remarks which made the girls turn their heads and giggle. I recognised them as girls from my part of the town, and 2 or 3 of them who I knew looked up and waved to me. Just then the street lamps come on, all together, and they made the stars that were beginning to glimmer in the night sky paler still. I felt my eyes getting tired, what with the lights and all the movement. I'd been watching in the street. There were little pools of brightness under the lamps, and now and then a tram car passed, lighting up a girl's hair or a smile or a silver bangle. Soon after this, as the trams became fewer and the sky showed velvety black above the trees and lamps, the streets grew emptier, almost imperceptibly, until a time come when there were nobody to be seen, and a cat, the first of the evening, crossed unhurrying in the deserted street. It struck me that I'd better see about some dinner. I had been leaning so long on the back of my chair, looking down, that my neck hurt, and I straightened myself up. I went down, brought some bread and spaghetti, did my cooking, and ate my meal standing. I had intended to smoke another cigarette at my window, but the night had turned rather chilly, and I decided against it. As I was coming back, after shutting the window, I glanced at the mirror, and saw reflected in it a corner of my table with my spirit lamp and some bits of bread beside it. It occurred to me somehow I'd gotten through another Sunday, that Mother were buried, and tomorrow I'd be going back to work as usual. Really, nothing in my life had changed. End of chapter 2. I'll take a drink. Chapter 3. I had a busy morning in my office. My employer were in a good humour. He even inquired if I wasn't too tired, and followed up by asking what Mother's age was. I thought a bit and then answered, around about 60, as I didn't want to make a blunder, at which he looked relieved, why I can't imagine, and seemed to think that closed the matter. There were a pile of bills of lading waiting on my desk, and I had to go through them all. Before leaving for lunch, I washed my hands. I always enjoyed doing this at midday. In the evening it was less pleasant, as the roller towel, after being used by so many people, was sopping wet. I once brought this to my employer's notice. It was regrettable he agreed, but it was mind a mere detail. I left the office building a bit later than usual, at 12:30, with Emmanuel, who works in the forwarding department. Our building overlooks the sea, and we paused for a moment on the steps to look at the shipping in the harbour. The sun was scorching hot. Just then a big truck come up with dinner change and backfires from the engine, and Emmanuel suggested we should try and jump it. I started to run. The truck was well away and we had to chase it for quite a distance. With all the heat and the noise from the engine, I felt half dazed. All I was conscious of were our mad rush along the waterfront, among cranes and winches, with dark holes of ships alongside and masts swaying in the offing. I was the first to catch up with the truck. I took a flying jump, landed safely, and helped Emmanuel to scramble in beside me. We was both of us out of breath, and the bumps of the truck on the rough laid cobbles made things worse. Emmanuel chuckled and patted in my ear. "We've made it." By the time we reached Celeste's restaurant, we were dripping with sweat. Celeste was at his usual place beside the entrance, with his apron bulging on his paunch, his white moustache worked to the fore. When he saw me, he was sympathetic and hoped I wasn't feeling too badly. I said no, I was extremely hungry. I ate very quickly and had some coffee to finish up. Then I went to my place and took a short nap, as I'd drunk a glass of wine too many. When I woke up, I smoked a cigarette before getting off my bed. I was a bit late and had to run for the tram. The office was stifled and I was kept idle all afternoon. So it came as a relief when we closed down and I was strolling slowly along the walls in the coolness. The sky was green and it were pleasant to be out of doors after the stuffy office. However, I went straight home as I had to put some potatoes on the boil. The all were dark and, when I was starting up the stairs, I almost bumped into old Salamano, who lived on the same floor as I. As usual, he had his dog with him. For 8 years the two had been inseparable. Salamano's spaniel was an ugly brute, afflicted with some skin disease, mange I expect. Anyhow, it has lost all its hair and its body is covered with brown scabs. Perhaps through living in one small room cooped up with his dog, Salamano has come to resemble it. His towy hair has gone very thin, and he has a reddish blotches on his face. And the dog has developed something of its master's queer, hunched-up gait. It always has its muzzle stretched far forward and its nose to the ground. But oddly enough, they're so much alike, they detest each other. Twice a day, at 11 and 6, the old fellow takes his dog for a walk, and for 8 years that walk has never varied. You can see them in the Rue de Lyon, the dog pulling his master along as hard as he can, till finally the old chap misses a step and nearly falls. Then he beats his dog and calls it names. The dog cowers and lags behind, its master's turn to The dog cowers and lags behind, and it's his master's turn to drag him along. Presently the dog forgets, starts tugging at the leash again, gets another hiding and more abuse. Then they out on the pavement, the pair of them, and glare at each other, the dog with terror and the man with hatred in his eyes. Every time they're out, this happens. When the dog wants to stop at a lamp post, the old boy won't let him and drags him on, and the wretched spaniel leads behind him a trail of little drops. But if he does it in the room, it means another hiding. It's been going on like this for 8 years, and Celeste always says it's a crying shame, and something should be done about it, but really one can't be sure. When I met him in the hall, Salamano were bawling at his dog, calling him a bastard, a lousy mongrel, and so forth, and the dog were whining. I said good evening, but the old fellow took no notice and went on cursing, so I thought I'd ask him what the dog had done. Again he didn't answer, but went on shouting, "You bloody cur," and the rest of it. I couldn't see very clearly, but he seemed to be fixing something on the dog's collar. I raised my voice a little. Without looking round, he mumbled in a sort of suppressed fury, "He's always in the way, blast him." And he started up the stairs, but the dog tried to resist and flattened itself on the floor, so he had to haul it up on the leash, step by step. Just then the man who lives on my floor come in from the street. The general idea hereabouts is that he's a pimp, but if one asks him what his job is, he says he's a warehouseman. One thing's sure, he isn't that popular in our street. Still, he often has a word for me, and drops in sometimes for a short talk in my room, because I listen to him. As a matter of fact, I find what he says quite interesting, so really I've no reason for freezing him off. His name is Sintes, Raymond Sintes. He's short and thick-set, has a nose like a boxer's, and always dresses very sprucely. He too once said to me, referring to Salamento, that it were a bloody shame, and asked me if I wasn't disgusted by the way the old man served his dog. I answered no. We went up the stairs together, Sintes and I. When I was turning at my door, he said, "Look here, how about having some grub with me? Have a black pudding and some wine." It struck me that this would save me on my having to cook my dinner, so I said, "Thanks very much." He too has only one room and a little kitchen without a window. I saw a pink and white plaster angel above his bed, and some photos of sporting champions and naked girls pinned to the opposite wall. The bed hadn't been made and the room was dirty. He began by lighting a paraffin lamp and fumbled in his pocket and produced a rather grimy bandage, which he wrapped around his right hand. I asked him what the trouble were. He told me he'd been having a rough house with a fellow who'd annoyed him. I am not one who looks for trouble, he explained. Only I'm a bit short-tempered. That fellow said to me, challenging like, "Come down off the tram if you're a man." I says, "You keep quiet, I ain't done nothing to you." Then he said I hadn't any guts. Well, that settled it. I got down off the tram and I said to him, "You better keep your mouth shut or I'll shut it for you." "I'd like to see you try," he says. Then I gave him one across the face and laid him out good and proper. After a bit I started to help him to get up, but all he did was to kick at me from where he lay. So I gave him one with my knee and a couple more swipes. He was bleeding like a pig when I'd done with him. I asked him if he'd had enough, and he said yes. Synthèse were busy fixing his bandage while he talked, and I was sitting on the bed. "So you see," he said, "it wasn't my fault. He was asking for it, wasn't he?" I nodded, and he added, "As a matter of fact, I want to ask you your advice about something. It's connected with this business. You've knocked about the world a bit, and I dare say you can help me. And then I'll be your pal for life. I never forget anyone who does me a good turn." When I made no comment, he asked me if I'd like us to be pals. I replied that I had no objection, and that appeared to satisfy him. He got out the black pudding, cooked it in a frying pan, and then laid the table, putting out 2 bottles of wine. While he was doing this, he didn't speak. We started dinner, and then he began telling me the whole story, hesitating a bit at first. There's a girl behind it, as usual. We slept together pretty regular. I was keeping her, as a matter of fact, and she cost me a tidy sum. That fellow I knocked down is her brother. Noticing that I said nothing, he added that he knew what the neighbours said about him, but it were a filthy lie. He had his principles like everybody else, and a job in a warehouse. "Well," I said, "to go on with my story, I found out one day that she was letting me down." He gave her enough money to keep her going without extravagance, though. He paid the rent of her rooms and 20 francs a day for food, 300 francs for rent and 600 for her grub, with a little present thrown in now and again, a pair of stockings or whatnot. See, 1,000 francs a month. But that wasn't enough for my fine lady. She was always grumbling that she couldn't make both ends meet with what I gave. So one day I says to her, "Look here, why not get a job for a few hours a day? That'd make things easier for me too. I bought you a new frock this month. I pay your rent and give you 20 francs a day. But you go and waste your money at the cafe with a pack of girls. You give them coffee and sugar. And of course the money comes out of my pocket. I treat you on the square, and that's how you pay me back." But she wouldn't hear of working, though, and she kept on saying she couldn't make do with what I gave her. And then one day I found out she was doing the dirty on me. He went on to explain that he discovered a lottery ticket in her bag, and when he asked where the money come from to buy it, she wouldn't tell him. Then another time he found a pawn ticket for 2 bracelets which he never set eyes on before. So I knew there was dirty work going on, and I told her I had nothing more to do with her. At first I gave her a good hiding, and I told her some home truths. I said there was only one thing interested her, and that was getting into bed with men whenever she had the chance. And I won't have stayed. You'll be sorry one day, my girl, and wish you'd got me back. All the girls in my street, they're jealous of your luck in having me to keep you. He'd beaten her till the blood come. Before that he'd never beaten her. Well, not hard anyhow, only affectionately like. She'd howl a bit and had to shut the window, then of course it ended as per usual. But this time I'm done with her. Only to my mind they ain't punished her enough. See what I mean? He explained that he were about this he wanted my advice. The lamp was smoking and he stopped pacing up and down the room to lower the wick. I just listened without speaking. I had an old bottle of wine to myself and my head was buzzing. As I'd used up my cigarettes I was smoking Raymond's. Some late trams passed and the last noises of the street died off with them. Raymond went on talking. What bored him was that he had a sort of lech on head, as he called it. He was quite determined to teach her a lesson. His first idea, he said, had been to take her to a hotel and then call in the special police. He'd persuade them to put her on the register as a common prostitute, and then would make her wild. Then he looked up some old friends of his in the underworld, fellows whom kept tarts for what they could make out of them, but they had practically nothing to suggest. Still, as he pointed out, that sort of thing should have been right up their street. What's the good of being in that line if you don't know how to treat a girl who's let you down? When he told them that, they suggested he should brand her, but that wasn't what he wanted either. It would need a lot of thinking out, but first he'd like to ask me something. Before he asked it, though, he'd like to have my opinion on the story he'd been telling, in a general way. I said I hadn't any, but I found it interesting. Did I think she really had done the dirty on him? I had to admit it looked like that. Then he asked me if I didn't think she should be punished, and what I'd do if I were in his shoes. I told him one could never be quite sure how to act in such cases, but I quite understood his wanting her to suffer for it. I drank some more wine while Raymond then lit another cigarette and began explaining what he proposed to do. He wanted to write her a letter, a real stinker, then he'd get it on the door, and at the same time make her repent of what she'd done. Then when she'd come back, he'd go to bed with her, and just when she were properly brained up, he'd spit in her face and throw her out on the room. I agreed it wasn't a bad plan, and it would punish her all right. But Raymond told me he didn't feel up to writing the kind of letter that was needed, and that was where I could help him. I didn't say anything. He asked me if I'd mind doing it right away, and I said no, I'll have a shot at it. He drank off a glass of wine and stood up. Then he pushed aside the plates and the bit of cold pudding that were left to make room around the table. After carefully wiping the oilcloth, he got a sheet of squared paper from the drawer of his bedside table. After that, an envelope, a small red wooden pen holder, and a square ink pot with purple ink in it. The moment he mentioned the girl's name, I knew she was a Moore. I wrote the letter. I didn't take much trouble over it, but I wanted to satisfy Raymond, as I'd no reason not to satisfy him. Then I read out what I'd written. Puffing at his cigarette, he listened, nodding now and then. "Read it again, please," he said. He seemed delighted. "Nasty stuff," he chuckled. "I could tell you were a brainy sort of boy, and you know what's what." At first I hardly noticed that old boy. It came back to me when he slapped me on the shoulders and said, "So now we're pals, ain't we?" I kept silent and he said it again. I didn't care one way or the other, but he seemed set on it, so I nodded and said yes. He put the letter in the envelope and we finished off the wine. Then both of us smoked for some minutes without speaking. The street was quiet, except when now and again a car passed. Finally I remarked that it was getting late, and Raymond agreed. "Time's gone mighty fast this evening," he added, when in a way that was true. I wanted to be in bed, and it was such an effort making a move. I must have looked tired, for Raymond told me I mustn't let things get one down. At first I didn't catch his meaning. Then he explained that he had heard of my mother's death. Anyhow, he said, that was something bound to happen one day or another. I appreciated that, and told him so. When I rose, Raymond shook hands very warmly, remarking that men always understood each other. After closing the door behind me, I lingered for some moments on the landing. The old building was quiet as the grave, a dank, dark smell rising from the well-hole of the stairs. I could hear nothing but the blood throbbing in my ears, and for a while I stood listening to it. Then the dog began to moan in old Salamano's room, and through the sleep-bound house the little plaintive sound rose slowly, like a flower growing out of the silence and darkness. And that's the end of part 3, or chapter 3 I should say. I have my little drink. Chapter 4. I had a busy time in the office throughout the week. Raymond dropped in once to tell me he'd sent off the letter. I went to the pictures twice with Emmanuel, who doesn't always understand what's happening on the screen, and asked one to explain it. Yesterday was Saturday, and Marie come as we had arranged. She had a very pretty dress with red and white stripes and leather sandals, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. One could see the outline of her firm little breasts, and her sun-tanned face was like a velvety brown flower. We took the bus and went to a beach I know some miles out of Algiers. It's just a strip of sand between 2 rocky spurs, with a line of rushes at the back along the tide line. At 4 o'clock the sun wasn't too up, but the water was pleasantly tepid, and small languid ripples were creeping up the sand. Marie taught me a new game. The idea was, while one swam, to suck in the spray of the waves, and when one's mouth was full of foam, to lie on one's back and spout out against the sky. It made a sort of frothy haze that melted in the air or fell back in a warm shower on one's cheek. But very soon my mouth was smarting with all the salt I'd drawn in. Then Mary came up and hugged me in the water, and pressed her mouth to mine. Her tongue cooled my lips, and we let the waves roll us about for a minute or two before swimming back to the beach. When we had finished dressing, Marie looked hard at me. Her eyes were sparkling. I kissed her. After that, neither of us spoke for quite a while. I pushed her to my side as we scrambled up the foreshore. Both of us were in an hurry to catch the bus, get back to my place and tumble on the bed. I'd left my window open and it was pleasant to feel the cool night air blowing over our sunburnt bodies. Marie said she were free next morning, so I proposed she should have lunch with me. She agreed and I went down a bus and meet. On my way back I heard a woman's voice in Raymond's room. A little later old Salamano started grumbling at his dog and presently there was a sound of boots and paws on the wooden stairs. Then, "Filthy brute, get on your car," and the two of them went down in the street. I told Mary about the old chap's habits and it made her laugh. She was wearing one of my pyjama suits and had the sleeves rolled up. When she laughed I wanted her again. A moment later she asked me if I loved her. I said that sort of question had no meaning really, but I supposed I didn't. She looked sad for a bit, but when we were getting out the lunch ready, she brightened up and started laughing. And when she laughs I always want to kiss her. It was just then that the row started in Raymond's room. Oh, that's starting in a minute, okay. I'll pause then. First we heard a woman saying something in a high-pitched voice, then Raymond bawling at her, "You let me down, you bitch, I'll learn you to let me down." There came some thuds, then a piercing scream. Made one's blood run cold, and in a moment there were a crowd of people on the landing. Marie and I went out to see. The woman was still screaming and Raymond still knocking her about. Mary said, "Wasn't it horrible?" I didn't answer anything. And she asked me to go and fetch a policeman, but I told her I didn't like policemen. However, one turned up pleasantly. The lodger on the second floor, a plumber, come up with him. When he banged on the door, the noise stopped inside the room. He knocked again, and after a moment the woman started crying, and Raymond opened the door. He had a cigarette dangling from his underlip and a rather sickly smile. "Your name?" Raymond gave his name. "Take the cigarette out of your mouth when you're talking to me," the policeman said gruffly. I'll pause here. I understand that we're doing 3 minutes of ads, so... yes. I finally figured out how to get the little notifications working, which is good. So I suppose this part here is only for, for people watching the VOD, or any subscribers who happen to be in chat. Oh, I never know for sure if anyone at all is there, really. I feel like I should make some comment on the text, really, but... well, I don't think I should, really. Nascar, I don't know if you should. I think you're in Agile at the moment, but if you're not, I do appreciate the 7-stream streak. But yeah, what am I thinking? It's an interesting little story. He's quite an unpleasant person, is our little narrator. Or maybe not unpleasant, though he's surrounded by some unpleasant people and he doesn't seem much loath to them. He's just very neutral, very flat, detached from it all. It's strange, really, because I find his voice very easy. Not necessarily particularly strong like some writing is. Like there are some stories where you can tell that the voice is very, very good and carry. It's like with Twain. But it feels very natural to me. I know this is, I would think Camus is French originally, so it's a translation, so it might be the translator, but it might be Camus. It might just be the voice of the character. But he talks like a rat. Talks like I do. But with a few bits of, what's got French vernacular thrown in for some variety, I suppose. And he lives his life, one day at a time, unaffected by the world around him. Strange way to be. Strange way to be. Alright, and the ad break should now have ended, if the robot who tells me about ads can be trusted. Which I can only assume it can be, because I have no other truth choice. Right. Back to it then. Take that cigarette out of your mouth when you're talking to me, the policeman said gruffly. Raymond hesitated, glanced at me, and kept the cigarette in his mouth. The policeman promptly swung his arms and gave him a good hard smack on the left cheek. The cigarette shot from his lips and dropped a yard away. Raymond made a wry face, but said nothing for a moment. Then in an humble tone he asked if he might pick up his fag. The officer said, "Yes," and added, "But don't you forget next time, we won't stand for any nonsense, not from blokes like you." Meanwhile the girl went on sobbing and repeating, "He hit me, the coward, he's a pimp." "Excuse me, officer," Raymond put in, "but is that in order? Calling a man a pimp in the presence of witnesses?" The policeman told him to shut his trap. Raymond then turned to the girl. "Don't you worry, my pet, we'll meet again." "That's enough," the policeman said, and told the girl to get away. Raymond would stay in his room till they summoned the police station. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," the policeman added, getting so tight he can't stand steady, while you're shaking all over. "I'm not dead," Raymond explained. "Only when I see you standing there and looking at me, I can't help trembling. That's only natural." They closed his door and we all went away. Maria and I finished getting our lunch ready, but she hadn't any appetite, and I ate nearly all. She left at once, and then I had a nap. Towards 3 there was a knock at my door, and Raymond come in. He sat down on the edge of my bed and for a minute or two said nothing. I asked him how it had gone off. He said it had all gone off quite smoothly at first, as per programme, only then she'd slapped his face and he'd seen red and started thrashing her. As for what happened after that, he didn't tell me, as I were there. "Well," I said, "you taught her a lesson, all right, and that's what you wanted, isn't it?" He agreed, and pointed out that wherever the police did, they wouldn't charge the fact that she'd had her punishment. As for the police, he knew exactly how to handle them. He'd like to know if I'd expect him to return the blow. If I'd expected him to return the blow when the policeman hit him. I told him I hadn't expected anything whatsoever, and anyhow, I had no use for the police. Raymond seemed pleased, and asked if I'd like to come out for a stroll with him. I got up from the bed and started brushing my hair. And Raymond said what he really wanted was for me to act as his witness. I told him I had no objections, and I didn't know what he expected me to say. "It's quite simple," he replied. "You've only got to tell him that the girl had let me down." So I agreed to be his witness. We went out together, and Raymond stood me a brandy in a cafe. Then we had a game of billiards. It was a close game, and I lost by only a few points. After that he proposed going to a brothel, but I refused. I didn't feel like it. As we were walking slowly back, he told me how pleased he was at having paid out his mistress so satisfactorily. He made himself extremely amiable to me, and I quite enjoyed our walk. When we was nearly home, I saw old Salamano on his doorstep. He seemed very excited. I noticed that his dog went with him. He would turn in like a teetotum, looking in all directions, and sometimes peering at the darkness of the hall with his little bloodshot eyes. Then he'd mutter something to himself and start gazing up and down the street again. Raymond asked him what were wrong, but he didn't answer at once. Then I heard him grunt, "The bastard, the filthy cur." When I asked him where his dog was, he scowled at me and snapped out, "Gone." A moment later, all of a sudden, he launched out into it. I'd taken him to the parade ground as usual. It was fair on, and one could hardly move for the crowd. I stopped at one of the booths to look at the handcuffed king. When I turned to go, the dog were gone. I didn't mean to get a smaller collar, but I never thought the brute could slip and get away like that. Raymond assured him the dog would find its way home, and told him stories of dogs that travelled miles and miles to get back to their masters. They seemed to make the old fellow even more worried than before. Don't you understand, they'll do away with him. The police, I mean. It's like anyone will take him and look after him, with all the scabs he puts everybody off. I told him there were a pound at the police station where stray dogs are taken. His dog was certain to be there, and he could get it back on payment of a small charge. He asked me how much the charge was, but I couldn't help him. Then he flew into a rage again. He said lately I'd given money for a take like that. No bloody fear, they can kill him for all I care. I went on calling his dog the usual names. Raymond gave a laugh and turned into the hall. I followed him upstairs and we parted on the landing. A minute or two later I heard Salamano's footsteps and a knock on my door. When I opened it, he halted for a moment in the doorway. "Excuse me, I'm hoping I'm not disturbing you." I asked him, but he shook his head. He was staring at his toe caps and the narrow hands were trembling. Without meeting my eyes, he started talking. "They won't really take him from me, will they? Monsieur Massoud? Surely they wouldn't do a thing like that. If they do, I don't know what will become of me. I told him that so far as I knew, they kept stray dogs in the pound for 3 days, waiting for their owners to call for them. And then they disposed of the dogs as they thought fit. He stared at me in silence and said, "Good evening." After that I heard him pacing up and down his room for quite a while, and his bed creaked. Through the wall there came to me a little wheezing sound, and I guessed that he were weeping. For some reason, I don't know what, I began to think of a mother. But I had to get up early the next day, so as I wasn't feeling hungry, I did without supper and went straight to bed. And the chapter 4. Chapter 5. Raymond rang me up at the office. He said that a friend of his, to whom he'd spoken about me. A thought has occurred to me. I believe you were in ads when you redeemed the 7 Street massacre, so just in case you... Well, I said something then, but if you didn't hear me, I do very much appreciate it. Chapter 5. Raymond rang me up at the office. He said that a friend of his, to whom he'd spoken about me, invited me to spend next Sunday at his little seaside bungalow just outside Algiers. No ads? Okay. Fair enough then. The robot is lying to me, as they always do. Can't trust them. I told him I'd have been delighted, only I'd promised to spend Sunday with a girl. Raymond promptly replied that she could come too. In fact, his friend's wife would be very pleased not to be the only other woman in a party of men. I'd have liked to hang up at once, as my employer doesn't approve of one using the office phone for private calls. But Raymond asked me to hold on. He had something else to tell me, and that was why he'd rung me up, though he could have waited till the evening to pass on the invitation. "It's like this," he said. "I have been shadowed in the morning by some Arabs, one of them the brother of the girl that I had other hour with. If you see him hanging around the house when you come back, pass me the word." I promised to do so. Just then my employer sent to me. For a moment I felt uneasy, as I suspected he was going to tell me to stick to my work and not to waste time chattering with friends over the phone. However, it was nothing of the kind. He wanted to discuss a project he had in view, as so far he'd come to no decision. He would open a branch at Paris, just to be able to deal with the big companies on the spot without postal delays, and he wanted to know if I'd like a post there. "You're a young man," he said, "and I'm pretty sure you'd enjoy living in Paris. And of course you could travel about France for some months in the year." I told him I was quite prepared to go, but really I didn't care much one way or the other. He then asked if a change of life, as he called it, didn't appeal to me, and I answered that one never changed one's real life. Anyhow, one life was quite as good as another, and my present one suited me quite well. At this he looked rather up, and told me that I were always shilly-shallied, and that I lacked ambition, a grave defect to his mind when one was in business. I returned to my work. I'd have preferred not to vex him, but I saw no reason for changing my life, and by large it wasn't an unpleasant one. As a student I'd had plenty of ambition and a kindly men, but when I had to drop my studies I very soon realised that were all pretty futile. Marie came that evening and asked if I'd marry her. I said I didn't mind. If she were keen on it, we'd get married. And she asked me again if I loved her. I replied, much as before, that a question meant nothing or next to nothing, but I supposed that I didn't. "If that's how you feel," she said, "why marry me?" I explained that it had no importance, really, but if it would give her pleasure, we could get married right away. I pointed out that anyhow, the suggestion come from her. As for me, I merely said yes. And she remarked that marriage were a serious matter, to which I answered no. She kept silent after that, staring at me in a curious way, and she asked, "Suppose another girl had asked you to marry her? I mean a girl you liked in the same way as you liked me. Would you have said yes to her too?" "Naturally." And she said she wondered if she really loved me or not. I, of course, couldn't enlighten her as to that. And after another silence she murmured something about my being a queer fellow, and I dare say that's why I love you. She added, "But maybe that's why one day I'll come to hate you." Which I had nothing to say, so I said nothing. She thought for a bit and started smiling, and taking my arm repeated that she were in earnest. She really wanted to marry me. "All right," I answered. "We'll get married whenever you like." I then mentioned the proposal made by my employer, and Mary said she'd love to go to Paris. When I told her I'd lived in Paris for a while, she asked me what it was like. A dingy sort of town in my mind, masses of pigeons and dark courtyards, and the people are washed out white faces. Then we went for a walk all the way across the town by the main streets. The women were good lookers, and I asked Mary if she too noticed this. She said yes, and that she saw what I meant. After that we said nothing for some minutes. However, as I didn't want her to leave me, I suggested we should dine together at Celeste's. She'd have loved to dine with me, she said, only she was booked up for the evening. We were near my place, and I said, au revoir then. She looked me in the eyes. Don't you want to know what I'm doing this evening? I did want to know, but I hadn't thought of asking her, and I guess she was making a grievance of it. I must have looked embarrassed, for suddenly she started laughing and bent towards me, pouting her lips for a kiss. I went by myself to Celeste's. When I had just started my dinner, an odd-looking little woman came in and asked if she might sit at my table. Of course she might. She had a chubby face like a ripe apple, bright eyes, and moved in a curious, jerky way, as if she were on wires. After taking off her close-fitting jacket, she sat down and started studying the bill of fare with a sort of rapt attention. Then she called Celeste and gave her order, very fast but quite distinctly. One didn't lose a word. While waiting for the hors d'oeuvre, she opened her bag, took out a slip of paper and a pencil, and held up the bill in advance. Diving into her bag again, she produced a purse and took from it the exact sum plus a small tip, and placed it on the cloth in front of her. Just then the waiter brought her hors d'oeuvre, which she proceeded to wolf down voraciously. While waiting for the next course, she produced another pencil, this time a blue one, from her bag, and the radio magazine for the coming week, and started making ticks against almost all the items of the daily programmes. There were a dozen pages in the magazine, and she continued studying them closely through the meal. When I finished mine, she was still ticking off items with the same meticulous attention. Then she rose, put on her jacket again with the same abrupt, robot-like gestures, and walked briskly out of the restaurant. Having nothing better to do, I followed her for a short distance. Keeping on the curb of the pavement, she walked straight ahead, never swerving or looking back, and it was extraordinary how fast she covered the ground, considering her smallness. In fact, the pace was too much for me, and I soon lost sight of her and turned back homewards. For a moment, the little robot, as I thought of her, had much impressed me, but I soon forgot about her. As I was turning in at my door, I ran into old Salamano. I asked him into my room, and he informed me that his dog was definitely lost. He'd been to the pound to inquire, but it weren't there, and the staff told him it had probably been run over. When he asked them whether it were any use inquiring about it at the police station, they said the police had more important things to attend to than keeping records of stray dogs run over in the streets. I suggested he should get another dog, but reasonably enough he pointed out he'd become used to this one. It wouldn't be the same thing. I was sitting on my bed with my legs up, and Salamano on a chair beside the table, facing me, his hands spread out on his knees. He kept on his battered felt hat and was mumbling away behind his draggled yellowish moustache. I found him rather boring, but I had nothing to do and didn't feel sleepy. So to keep the conversation going, I asked some questions about his dog, how long he had it and so forth. He told me he got it soon after his wife's death. He had married rather late in life. When a young man, he'd wanted to go on the stage. During his military service, he'd often played in the regimental theatricals and acted rather well, so everybody said. However, finally he had taken a job in the railway, and he didn't regret it, as now he had a small pension. He and his wife had never hit it off very well, but they got used to each other, and when she died he felt lonely. One of his mates on the railway, whose bitch had just had bumps, offered him one, and he had taken it as a companion. He'd had to feed it from the bottle at first, but as a dog's life is shorter than a man's, they'd, so to speak, grown old together. They were a cantankerous spirit, Salamano said. Now and then we had some proper set-tos, he and I, but he was a good take all the same. I said he looked well bred, and that evidently pleased the old man. Ah, but you should have seen him before the illness, he said. He had a wonderful coat. In fact, that was his best point, really. I tried hard to cure him every mortal night after he got the skin disease. I rubbed the ointment in, but his real trouble was old age, and there's no curing that. Just then I yawned, and the old chap said he'd better make a move. I told him he could stay, and that I was sorry about what had happened to his dog. He thanked me, and mentioned that my mother had been fond of his dog. He referred to her as, "Your poor mother, and we're afraid I must be feeling her death terribly." When I said nothing, he added hastily, and with rather an embarrassed air, that some of the people in the street said nasty things about me, because I'd sent my mother to the home. But he, of course, knew better. He knew how devoted to my mother I had always been. I answered, why I still don't know. It surprised me to learn I'd produced such a bad impression. As I couldn't afford to keep her here, it seemed the obvious thing to do to send her to the home. In any case, I added, for years she'd never had a word to say to me, and I could see she was moping with no one to talk to. Yes, they said, and at the home one makes friends anyhow. He got up, saying it was high time for him to be in bed, and that life was going to be a bit of a problem for him under the new conditions. For the first time since I'd known him, he held out his hand to me, rather shyly, I thought, and I could feel the scales in his skin. Just as he was going out the door, he turned and, smiling a little, said, "Let's hope the dogs won't bark again tonight. I always think it's mine I hear." And the chapter 5. I'll take my drink. Chapter 6. It were an effort waking up that Sunday morning. Marie had to jog my shoulders and shout my name. As we wanted to get into the water early, we didn't trouble about breakfast. My head was aching slightly, and my first cigarette had a bitter taste. Marie told me I looked like a mourner at a funeral, and I certainly did feel very limp. She was wearing a white dress and had her hair loose. I told her she looked quite ravishing like that, and she laughed happily. On our way out, we banged on Raymond's door, and he shouted that he'd be with us in a jiffy. We went down to the street, and because of my being rather under the weather, and I having kept the blind down in my room, the glare of the morning sun hit me in the eyes like a clenched fist. Marie, however, almost dancing with delight, and kept repeating, "What a heavenly day." After a few minutes I was feeling better, and I noticed that I was hungry. I mentioned this to Marie, but she paid no attention. She was carrying an oilcloth bag in which she had stowed our bathing kit and towel. Presently we heard Raymond shutting his door. He was wearing blue trousers, a short-sleeved white shirt, and a straw hat. I noticed that his forearms were rather hairy, but the skin was very white beneath. The straw hat made Marie giggle. Personally, I was rather put off by his get-up. He seemed in high spirits, and was whistling as he came out down the stairs. He greeted me with, "Hello, old boy," and addressed Marie as Mademoiselle. On the previous evening we had visited the police station, where I gave evidence for Raymond about the girls having been false to him, so they let him off with a warning. I didn't check my statement. After some talks on the doorstep, we decided to take the bus. The beach was within easy walking distance, but the sooner we got there, the better. Just as we were starting for the bus stop, Raymond plucked my sleeve and told me to look across the street. I saw some Arabs lounging against the tobacconist's window. They were staring at us silently in the special way these people have, as if we were blocks of stone or dead trees. Raymond whispered that the second Arab from the left was his man, and I thought he looked rather worried. However, he assured me that all that was ancient history. Marie, who hadn't followed his remarks, asked, "What is it?" I explained that those Arabs across the way had a grudge against Raymond. She insisted on our going at once. Then Raymond laughed and squared his shoulders. "The young lady were quite right," he said. "There were no point in hanging about here." Halfway to the bus stop he glanced back over his shoulder and said the Arabs weren't following us. I too looked back. They were exactly as before, gazing in the same vague way at the spot where we had been. When we were in the bus, Raymond, who now seemed quite at ease, kept making jokes to amuse Marie. I could see he was attracted by her, but she had hardly a word for him. Now and again she would catch my eye and smile. We alighted just outside Algiers. The beach is not far from the bus stop. One has only to cross a patch of highland, a sort of plateau, which overlooks the sea and shelves down steeply to the sands. The ground here was covered with yellowish pebbles and white lilies that showed snow white against the blue of the sky, which is already the hard metallic glint it gets on very hot days. Marie amused herself swishing her bag against the flowers and sending the petals showering out in all directions. Then we walked between two rows of little houses with wooden balconies and green or white palings. Some of them were half hidden in clumps of tamarisks, others rose naked from the stony plateau. Before we come to the end of it, the sea were in full view. It lay smooth as a mirror, and in the distance a big headland jutted out over its black reflection. Through the still air came the faint buzz of a motor engine, and we saw a fishing boat very far out, gliding almost imperceptibly across the dazzling smoothness. Marie picked some rock irises. Going down the steep path leading to the sea, we saw some bathers already in the sands. Raymond's friend owned a small wooden bungalow at the near end of the beach. His back rested against the cliffside, while the front stood on piles, which the water were already lapping. Raymond introduced us to his friend, whose name was Marcel. He was tall, broad-shouldered and thick-set. His wife was a plump, cheerful little woman, who spoke with a Paris accent. Masson promptly told us to make ourselves at home. He'd gone out fishing, he said, first thing in the morning, and there would be fried fish for lunch. I congratulated him on his little bungalow, and he said he always spent his weekends and holidays here. With the missus, needless to say, he added. I glanced at her and noticed that she and Marie seemed to be getting on well together, laughing and chattering away. For the first time, perhaps, I seriously considered the possibility of my marrying her. Masson wanted to have a swim at once, but his wife and Raymond were disinclined to move. So only the three of us, Marie, Masson and myself, went down to the beach. Marie promptly plunged in, but Masson and I waited a bit. He was rather slow of speech, and had, I noticed, an habit of saying, and what's more, between his phrases, even when the second added nothing really to the first. Talking to Marie, he said, "She's an awfully pretty girl, and what's more charming." But I soon ceased paying attention to this trick of his, while basking in the sunlight, which, I noticed, were making me feel much better. The sand was beginning to stroke up underfoot, and though I were eager for a dip, I postponed it for a minute or two more. At last I said to Masson, "Shall we go in now?" and plunged. Masson walked in gingerly, and only began to swim when he were out of his depth. He swam hand over hand and made slow headway, so I left him behind and caught up to Marie. The water was cold, and I felt all the better for it. We swam a long way out, Marie and I side by side, and it was pleasant, feeling how our movements matched hers and mine, and how we both were in the same mood, enjoying every moment. Once we were out in the open, we lay on our backs, as I gazed up at the sky, I could feel the sun drawing up the film of salt water on my lips and cheeks. We saw Masson swim back to the beach and slump down in the sand under the sun. In the distance he looked enormous, like a stranded whale. Then Marie proposed that we should swim tandem. She went ahead, and I put my arms round her waist from behind, and while she drew me forward with her arm strokes, I kicked out behind to help us on. That sound of little splashes had been in my ears for so long that I began to feel I'd had enough of it. So I let go of Marie and swam back at an easy pace, taking long, deep breaths. When I made the beach, I stretched myself belly downward beside Masson, resting my face in the sand. I told him it was fine here, and he agreed. Presently Marie came back. I raised my head to watch her approach. She was glistening with brine and holding her hair back. Then she lay down beside me, and what with the combined warmth of our bodies and the sun, I felt myself dropping off to sleep. After a while, Marie tugged at my arm and said Masson had gone to his place. It must be nearly lunchtime. I rose up once as I was feeling hungry, but Marie told me I hadn't kissed her once since early morning. That was so, but I wanted to several times. "Let's go in the water again," she said, and we ran into the sea and lay flat among the ripples for a moment. Then we swam a few strokes, and when we were almost out of our depth, she flung her arms round me and hugged me. I felt her legs twining round mine, and my senses tingled. When we got back, Masson were on the steps of his bungalow, shouting to us to come. I told him I were ravenously hungry, and he promptly turned to his wife and said he'd taken quite a fancy to me. The bread were excellent, and I had my full share of the fish. Then come some steak and chips. None of us spoke while eating. Masson drank a lot of wine, and kept refilling my glass the moment it were empty. By the time coffee were handed round, I was feeling quite slightly muzzy, and I started smoking one cigarette after another. Masson, Raymond and I discussed the plan of spending the whole of August on the beach together, sharing expenses. Suddenly Marie exclaimed, "I say, do you know the time? It's only 11:30. We were all surprised at that, and Masson remarked that we had had a very early lunch. But really lunch was a movable feast. One had it when one felt like it. This set Marie laughing. I don't know why. I suspect she drank a bit too much. Then Masson asked if I'd like to come with him for a stroll on the beach. "My wife always has a nap after lunch," he said. "Personally, I find it doesn't agree with me. What I need is a short walk. I'm almost telling her it's the much better option for the health, but of course she's entitled to her own opinion." Marie proposed to stay and help with the washing up. Madame Masson smiled and said that in that case the first thing was to get the men out of the way. So we went out together, the three of us. The light were almost vertical, and the glare from the water seared one's eyes. The beach were quite deserted now. One could hear a faint tinkle of knives and forks and crockery, and the shacks and bungalows lining the foreshore. Heat were welling up from the rocks, and one could hardly breathe. At first Raymond and Masson talked of things and people I didn't know. I gathered they'd been acquainted for some time, and had even lived together for a while. We went down to the water's edge and walked along it. Now and then a longer wave wetted our canvas shoes. I won't think of anything at all. The sunlight beating down upon my bare head made me feel half asleep. Just then Raymond said something to Mason that I didn't quite catch. At the same moment I noticed two Arabs in the blue dungarees a long way down the beach, coming in our direction. I gave Raymond a look and he nodded, saying, "That's him." We walked steadily on. Mason wondered how they'd managed to track us here. My impression was that they'd seen us take the bus and noticed Marie's oilcloth bathing bag, but I didn't say anything. Though the Arabs walked quite slowly, they were much nearer already. We didn't change our pace, but Raymond said, "Listen, if there's enough of us, you, Mason, take on the second one. I'll tackle the fellow who's after me, and you, Massot, stand by the whelp if another one comes up, and lay him out." I said, "Right," and Mason put his hands in his pockets. The sun was hot as fire, and I could have sworn it would glowing red. The distance between us and the Arabs was steadily decreasing. When we was only a few steps away, the Arabs halted. Mason and I slowed down, while Raymond went straight up to his man. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw the native lowering his head, as if to bite him in the chest. Raymond lashed out promptly, and shouted at Mason to come. Mason went up to the man who had been marking, and struck him twice with all his might. The fellow fell flat into the water, and stayed there some seconds, with bubbles coming up to the surface round his head. Meanwhile Raymond had been slugging the other man, his face was streaming with blood. He glanced at me over his shoulder and shouted, "Just you watch, I ain't finished with him yet." "Look out," I cried, "he's got a knife." I spoke too late. The man had gashed Raymond's arm, and his mouth as well. Mason sprang forward, the other Arab got up from the water, and placed himself behind the fellow with the knife. We didn't dare to move. The two natives backed away slowly, keeping us at bay with the knife, and never taking their eyes off us. While they were at a safe distance, they swung round and took their heels. We stood stock still with the sunlight beating down on us. Blood was dripping from Raymond's wounded arm, which he was squeezing hard above the elbow. Mason remarked they were a doctor who always spent his Sunday here, and Raymond said, "Good, let's go to him at once." He could hardly get the words out, as the blood from the other wound made bubbles in his mouth. We each gave him an arm and helped him back to the bungalow. Once we was there, he told us the wounds weren't so very deep, and he could walk to where the doctor was. Marie had gone quite pale, and Madame Masson were in tears. Mason and Raymond went to the doctor's, while I was left behind in the bungalow to explain matters to the women. I didn't much relish the task, and soon dried up and started smoking, staring at the sea. Raymond came back about 1:30, accompanied by Mason. He had his arm bandaged and a strip of sticker plaster on the corner of his mouth. The doctor assured him it was nothing serious, but he was looking very glum. Mason tried to make him laugh, but without success. Presently Raymond said he was going for a stroll on the beach. I asked him where he proposed to go, and he grumbled something about wanting to take the air. We, Mason and I, then said we'd go with him, but he flew into a rage and told us to mind our own business. Mason said we mustn't insist in that state he was in. However, when he went out, I followed him. It was like a furnace outside, with the sunlight splintering into flakes of fire on the sand and sea. We walked for quite a while, and I had an idea that Raymond had a definite idea where he was going, but probably I was mistaken about this. At the end of the beach we come to a small stream that had cut a channel into the sand, after coming out from behind the biggest rock. There we found our two Arabs again, lying on the sand in their blue dungarees. They looked harmless enough, as if they didn't bear any malice, and neither made any move when we approached. The man who had slashed Raymond stared at him without speaking. The other man was blowing down a little reed, and extracting from it 3 notes of the scale, which he played over and over again while he watched us from the corner of his eye. For a while nobody moved. It was all sunlight and silence, except for the tinkle of the stream, and those 3 little lonely sounds. Then Raymond put his hand into his revolver pocket, but the Arab still didn't move. I noticed that the man playing the reed had his big toes splayed out almost at right angles to his feet. Still keeping his eye on the man, Raymond said to me, "Shall I plug him?" I thought quickly. If I told him not to, considering the mood he were in, he might very well fly in with temper and use his gun. So I said the very first thing that came into my head. "He hasn't spoken to you yet. It'd be a low-down trick to shoot him like that, in cold blood." And again for some moments one heard nothing but the intake of the stream and the fluttering notes waving through the hot, still air. "Well," Raymond said, "if that's how you feel, I'd better say something insulting, and if he answers back I'll loose it off." "Right," I said. "Only if we don't get out the knife you've no business to fire." Raymond began to fidget. The Arab with the reed went on playing, and both of them watched our movements. "Listen," I said to Raymond. "You take on the fellow on the right and give me your revolver. If the other one starts making trouble or gets out his knife, I'll shoot." The sun glinted on Raymond's revolver as he handed it to me. but nobody made a move yet. It was just as if everything had cleared in on us so that we wouldn't stir. We could only watch each other, never lowering our eyes. The whole world seemed to come to a standstill on this little strip of sand between the sunlight and the sea, the twofold silence of the reed and stream. And just then it crossed my mind that one might fire, or not fire, and it would come to absolutely the same thing. Then all of a sudden the arrows vanished. They'd slipped like lizards under the cover of the rock. So Raymond and I turned and walked back. He seemed happier and began talking about the bus to catch for our return. When we reached the bungalow, Raymond promptly went up the wooden steps, but I halted on the bottom one. The light seemed thudding in my head, and I couldn't face the effort needed to go up the steps and make myself amiable to the women. But the heat was so great it was just as bad staying where I was, under that flood of blinding light falling from the sky. The stay to make a move, again much the same. After a moment I returned to the beach and started walking. There were the same red glare as far as the eye could reach, and small waves were wrapping the hot sand in little florid gaps. As I slowly walked towards the boulder at the end of the beach, I could feel my temples swollen under the impact of the light. It pressed itself upon me, trying to check my progress, and each time I felt a hot blast strike my forehead, I gritted my teeth, I clenched my fists in my trouser pocket, and keyed up every nerve to fend off the sun and the dark befuddlement it was pouring into me. Whenever a blade of vivid light shot upward from the bit of shell or broken glass lying on the sand, my jaw set hard. I wasn't going to be beaten, and I walked steadily on. The small black hump of rock came into view far down the beach. It was rimmed by a dazzling sheen of light, a feathery spray, but I was thinking of the cold, clear stream beyond it, and longing again to hear the tinkle of running water. Anything to be rid of the glare and the sight of women in tears, the strain and effort, and to retrieve the pool of shadow by the brook and its cool silence. When I came nearer, I saw that Raymond's Arab had returned. He was by himself this time, lying on his back, his hands behind his head, his face shaded by the rock, while the sun beat on the rest of his body. One could see his dungarees steaming in the heat. I was rather taken aback. My impression had been that the instant were closed, and I hadn't given a thought to it on my way here. On seeing me, the Arab raised himself a little, and his hand went to his pocket. Naturally, I gripped Raymond's revolver in the pocket of my coat, and the Arab let himself sink back again, but without taking his hand from his pocket. I was some distance off, at least 10 yards, and most of the time I saw him as a blurred dark form wobbling in the heat haze. Sometimes, however, I had glimpses of his eyes glowing between the half-closed lids. The sound of the waves were even lazier, feebler than at noon, but the light hadn't changed. It was pounding fiercely as ever on the long stretch of sand that had ended at the rock. For 2 hours the sun seemed to have made progress, becalmed in a sea of molten steel. Far out on the horizon, a steamer was passing. I could just make out from the corner of my eye a small black moving patch, while I kept my gaze fixed on the Arab. It struck me that all I had to do was turn, walk away, and think no more about it. But the old beach, pulsing with heat, was pressing on my back. I took some steps towards the stream. The Arab didn't move. After all, there was still some distance between us. Perhaps because of the shadow in his face, he seemed to be grinning at me. I waited. The heat was beginning to scorch my cheeks. Beads of sweat were gathering in my eyebrows. It was just the same sort of heat as at my mother's funeral, and I had the same disagreeable sensation, especially in my forehead, where all the veins seemed to be bursting through the skin. I couldn't stand it any longer and took another step forward. I knew it was a fool thing to do. I shouldn't get out of the sun by moving on a yard or so, but I took that step, just one step forward. And then the Arab drew his knife, and he held it up towards me athwart the sunlight. A shaft of light shot upwards from the steel, and I felt as if a long thin blade transfixed my forehead. At the same moment, all the sweat that accumulated in my eyebrows splashed down on my eyelids, covering them with a warm film of moisture. Beneath a veil of brine and tears, my eyes were blinded. I was conscious only of the symbols of the sun clashing on my skull, and less distinctly of the keen blade of light flashing from the knife, scarring my eyelashes and gouging at my eyeballs. And everything began to reel before my eyes. A fiery gust came from the seas, while the sky cracked in two from end to end, and a great sheet of flame poured down through the rift. Every nerve in my body were a steel spring, and my grip closed the revolver. The trigger gave, The smooth underbelly of the bark jogged my palm, and so with that crisp whip-crack sound it all began. I shook off my sweat in the clinging veil of light. I knew I'd shattered the balance of the day, the spacious calm of the beach on which I had been happy. But I fired 4 shots more into the inert body on which they left no visible trace, and each successive shot were another loud, fateful rap on the door of my undoing. That's the end of part 1. I'm starting to feel a bit of a tickle in my throat, but I intend to finish this tonight, so I'm going to go briefly have a little, on top of my normal little drink, I'm going to have a little bit of some honey tea I've got brewed up ahead of time. Thank you kindly, Naska. I shall do so indeed. Yeah, I'll have my water and my honey tea, and then I'll do a little bit of reflecting on the first part before we carry on. Right, that's a good deal better. Right, okay. So, the end of part 1. I suspect there's only 2 parts given the length of the text and where we've gotten to so far. What's happened then? Well, we follow the story of a man who seems very detached to his own life, unmoved by his own mother's funeral, seemingly. And we followed him as he pursues a romance leading towards marriage with little enthusiasm, helps his neighbour get revenge on a girl with little enthusiasm, lives his life, spends his leisure time with little enthusiasm, works with little enthusiasm, observes the world around him with little enthusiasm, and finally murders a man in cold blood with little enthusiasm. A man utterly detached from the world. For him it makes no difference whether the gun is fired or not, whether he goes up into the house or walks back down the beach. A man removed from it all. Well, I think that's all I've got to say for now, so without further ado, let's press on. Part 2, chapter the first. I was questioned several times immediately after my arrest, but they were all formal examinations as to my identity and so forth. At the first of these, which took place in the police station, nobody seemed to take much interest in the case. However, when I was brought before the examining magistrate a week later, I noticed that he eyed me with distinct curiosity. Like the others, he began by asking my name, address and occupation, the date and place of my birth. Then he inquired if I had chosen a lawyer to defend me. I answered no, I hadn't thought about it, and asked him if it were really necessary for me to have one. Why do you ask that? He replied. I replied that I regarded my case as very simple. He smiled. Well, it may seem so to you, but you've got to abide by the law, and if you don't engage a lawyer, the court will have to appoint one for you. It struck me as an excellent arrangement, and the authorities should see the details of this kind, and I told him so. He nodded and agreed that the code were all that could be desired. At first I didn't take him quite seriously. The room in which he interviewed me was much like an ordinary sitting room, with curtained windows and a single lamp standing on the desk. This light fell on the armchair in which he had me sit, while his own face stayed in shadow. I had read descriptions of such scenes in books. At first it all seemed like a game. After our conversation, however, I had a good look at him. He was a tall man with clean-cut features, deep-set blue eyes, a big grey moustache and abundant, almost snow-white hair, and he gave me the impression of being highly intelligent and, on the whole, likeable enough. There was only one thing that put me off. His mouth had, now and again, a rather ugly twist. But it seemed to only be a sort of nervous tick. When leaving, I very nearly held up my hand and said goodbye, just in time I remembered that I'd killed a man. Next day a lawyer come to my cell, a small plump youngish man with sleek black hair. In spite of the heat, I were in my shirt sleeves, he were wearing a dark suit, stiff collar and a rather showy tie, with broad black and white stripes. After depositing his briefcase on my bed, he introduced himself, and added that he perused the record of my case with the utmost care. His opinion was that it would need cautious handling, but there were every prospect of my getting off, provided I followed his advice. I thanked him, and he said, "Good, now let's get down to it." Sitting on the bed, he said that they had been marking investigations into my private life. They had learnt that my mother died recently in an home. Inquiries had been conducted at Marengo, and the police informed that I had shown great callousness at my mother's funeral. "You must understand," the lawyer said, "that I don't relish having to question you about such a matter. It has much importance, and unless I find some way of answering the charge of callousness, I shall be handicapped in conducting your defence. And that is where you and only you can help me." He went on to ask if I felt grief on that sad occasion. The question struck me as an odd one, personally. I'd have been much embarrassed by having to ask anyone a thing like that. I answered that in recent years I'd rather lost the habit of noting my feelings, and hardly knew what to answer. I could truthfully say I'd been quite fond of Mother, but really that didn't mean much. All normal people, I added as an afterthought, have more or less desired the death of those they loved at some time or another. Here the lawyer interrupted me, looking greatly perturbed. "You must promise me not to say anything of that sort at the trial, or to the examining magistrate." I promised to satisfy him, but I explained that my physical condition at any given moment often influenced my feelings. For instance, on the day I attended Mother's funeral, I was fagged out and only half awake, so really I hardly took stock of what was happening. Anyhow, I could assure him of one thing: I'd rather Mother hadn't died. The lawyer, however, looked displeased. "That's not enough," he said curtly. After considering for a bit, he asked me if I could say that on the day I had kept my feelings under control. "No," I said, "that wouldn't be true." He gave me a queer look, as if I slightly revolted him, then informed me in an almost hostile tone that in any case the head of the house and some staff would be cited as witnesses. "And that might do you a very nasty turn," he concluded. When I suggested that Mother's death had no connection with the charge against me, he merely replied that the remark showed I'd never had any dealings with the law. Soon after this he left, looking quite vexed. I wish he had stayed longer, and I could have explained to him that I desired his sympathy, not for him to make a better job of my defence, but, if I might put it so, spontaneously. I could see that I got on his nerves. He couldn't make me out, and, naturally enough, this irritated him. Once or twice I had a mind to assure him that I was just like everybody else, quite an ordinary person, but really that would have served no great purpose. I let it go, out of laziness as much as anything else. Later in the day I was taken again to the examining magistrate's office. It was 2 in the afternoon, and this time the room was flooded with light. There were only a thin curtain on the window, and extremely hot. After inviting me to sit down, the magistrate informed me, in a very polite tone, that, owing to unforeseen circumstances, my lord were unable to be present. I should be quite entitled, he added, to reserve my answers to his questions until my lord could attend. To this I replied that I could answer for myself. He pressed a bell, pushing his desk, and a young clerk come in and seated himself just behind me. Then we, I and the magistrate, settled back in our chairs, and the examination began. He led off by remarking that I had a reputation of being a taciturn, rather self-centred person. He'd like to know what I had to say to this. I answered, "Well, I rarely have anything much to say, so naturally I keep my mouth shut." He smiled as on the previous occasion, and agreed that was the best of reasons. "In any case," he added, "it has little or no importance." After a short silence, he suddenly leaned forward, looked me in the eye, and said, raising his voice a little, "What really interests me is you." I wasn't quite clear what he meant, so I made no comment. "There are several things," he continued, "that puzzle me about your crime. I feel sure that you will help me understand them." When I replied that really it was quite simple, he asked me to give him an account of what I'd done that day. As a matter of fact, I had already told him at our first interview, in a summary sort of way, of course, about Raymond, the beach, our swim, the fight, and then the beach again, and the 5 shots I'd fired. But went over it all again, and after each phrase he nodded. "Quite so, quite so." When I described the body lying on the sand, he nodded more emphatically and said, "Good." Personally, I was tired of repeating the same story. I felt as if I'd never talked so much in all my life before. After another silence, he stood up and said he'd like to help me. I interested him, and with God's help, he would do something for me in my trouble. But first he must put a few more questions. He began by asking bluntly if I'd loved my mother. "Yes," I replied, "like everybody else." The clerk behind me, who had been typing away at a steady pace, must just then have hit the wrong keys, as I heard him pushing the carriage back and crossing something out. Next, without any apparent logical connection, the magistrate sprung another question. Why did you fire 5 consecutive shots? I thought for a bit, and explained that they weren't quite consecutive. I fired 1 at first, and the other 4 after a short interval. Why did you pause between the first and second shot? I seem to see it hovering again before my eyes, the red glow of the beach, and I feel that fiery breath on my cheeks. And this time I made no answer. During the silence which followed, the magistrate kept fidgeting, running his fingers through his hair and half rising and sitting down again. Finally, planting his elbow on the desk, he bent towards me with a queer expression. Why did you go on firing at a prostrate man? Again I found nothing to reply. The magistrate drew his hand across his forehead and repeated in a slightly different tones. I ask you why. I insist on your telling me. I still kept silent. Suddenly he rose, walked to a file cabinet standing against the opposite wall, pulled a drawer open and took from it a silver crucifix, which we were waving as he came back to the desk. Do you know who this is? His voice changed completely. It was vibrant with emotion. Of course I do, I answered. I seemed to start him off again. He began speaking at great pace. He told me he believed in God, and that even the worst of sinners could obtain forgiveness of him. But first he must repent and become like a little child, with a simple trust in heart, open to conviction. You were leaning right across the table, brandishing his crucifix before my eyes. As a matter of fact, I had great difficulty in following his remarks, as, for one thing, the office was so stiflingly hot, and big flies were buzzing around and setting on my cheek. Also because he rather alarmed me. Of course I realised it were absurd to feel like that, considering that after all it were I who was the criminal. However, as he continued talking, I did my best to understand, and I gathered that there were only one point in my confession that had needed clearing up, the fact that I had waited before firing a second time. All the rest were, so to speak, quite in order. This completely baffled him. I started to tell him that he was wrong and insisted on this. The point were of quite minor importance. But before I could get the words out, he had drawn himself up to his full height, and were asking me very earnestly if I believed in God. When I said no, he plumped down in his chair indignantly. That were unthinkable, he said. All men believed in God, even those who reject him. Of this he were absolutely sure. If ever he come to doubt it in his life, his life would lose all meaning. Do you wish, he asked indignantly, my life to have no meaning? Really, I couldn't see how my wishes come into it, and I told him as much. While I was talking, he thrust the crucifix again just under my nose and shouted, I, anyhow, am a Christian, and I pray him to forgive you your sins. My poor young man, how can you not believe that he suffered for your sake? I noticed that his manner seemed genuinely solicitous when he said, my poor young man, but I was beginning to have enough of it. The room was growing steadily hotter. As I usually do when I want to get rid of someone whose conversation bores me, I pretend to agree, at which, rather to my surprise, his face lit up. You see? And won't you own that you believe and put your trust in him? I must have shaken my head again, for he sank back in his chair, looking limp and dejected. For some moments there was a silence, during which the typewriter, which had been clacking away all the time we talked, caught up with the last remark. Then he gazed at me intently, and rather sadly. Never in all my experience have I known a soul so case-hardened as yours, he said in a low tone. All the criminals who have come before me until now wept when they saw this symbol of our Lord's suffering. I was on the point of replying that were precisely because they were criminals, but then I realised that I too come under the description, somewhat with an idea to which I never could get reconciled. To indicate presumably that the interview were over, the magistrate stood up. In the same weary tone he had asked me a last question. Did I regret what I had done? After thinking a bit, I said that what I felt was less regret than a kind of vexation. I couldn't find a better word for it, but he didn't seem to understand. This were as far as things went at that day's interview. I come before the magistrate many times more, but on these occasions my lawyer always accompanied me. The examinations were confined to asking me to amplify my previous statements, or else the magistrate and my lawyer discussed technicalities. At such times they took very little notice of me, and in any case, the tone of the examination changed as time went on. The magistrate seemed to have lost interest in me, and had come to some sort of decision about my case. He never mentioned God again, or displayed any of the religious fervour I had found so embarrassing at our first interview. The result was that our relations became more cordial. After a few questions, followed by an exchange of remarks with my lawyer, the magistrate closed the interview. My case had taken its course, as he put it. Sometimes, too, the conversation were a general order, and the magistrate and lawyer encouraged me to join in it. I began to breathe more freely. Neither of the two men at these times showed the least hostility towards me, and everything went so smoothly, so amiably, that I had an absurd impression of being one of the family. I can honestly say that during the 11 months these examinations lasted, I got so used to them that I was almost surprised at having ever enjoyed anything better than those rare moments when the magistrate, after escorting me to the door of the office, would pat my shoulder and say in the friendliest tone, "Well, Mr. Antichrist, that's all for the present," after which I was made over to my warders. That's the end of chapter 1. Take my drink now. Chapter 2. There are some things of which I never cared to talk, and a few days after I'd been sent to prison, I decided that this phase of my life was one of them. However, as time went by, I come to feel that this aversion had no real substance. In point of fact, during those first few days, I was hardly conscious of being in prison. I had always a vague hope that something would turn up, some agreeable surprise. The change comes soon after Marie's first and only visit. From the day when I got her letter telling me they wouldn't let her come to see me anymore because she wasn't my wife, and from that day I realised this still was my last home. A dead end, as one says. On the day of my arrest, they put me in a biggish room with several other prisoners, mostly Arabs. They grinned when they saw me enter and asked what I'd done. I told them I'd killed an Arab, and they kept mum for a while. But presently night began to fall, and one of them explained to me how to lay out my sleeping mat. By rolling up one end, one makes a sort of bolster. At night I felt bugs crawling over my face. Some days later I was put by myself in a cell where I slept on a plank bed hinged to the wall. The only other furniture were a latrine bucket and a tin basin. The prison stands up on a rising ground, and through my little window I had glimpses of the sea. One day when I was hanging on the bars, straining my eyes towards the sunlight, playing on the waves, a warder entered and said I had a visitor. I thought it must be Marie, so it were. To go to the visitor's room, I was taken along a corridor, then up a start of steps, then along another corridor. It was a very large room, lit by big bow windows, and divided into 3 compartments by high iron grilles running transversely between the 2 grilles. There was a gap of some 30 feet, a sort of no man's land between the prisoners and their friends. I was led to a point exactly opposite Marie's, who were wearing her striped dress. On my side of the rails were about a dozen other prisoners, Arabs for the most part. On Marie's side were mostly Moorish women. She was wedged between a small old woman with tight-set lips and a fat matron without an hat, who were talking shrilly and gesticulated all the time. Because of the distance between the visitors and prisoners, I found I too had to raise my voice. When I come into the room, the babble of voices echoing on the bare walls and the sunlight steaming in, flooding everything in an harsh white glare, made me feel quite dizzy. After the relative darkness and the silence of my cell, it took me some moments to get used to these conditions. After a bit, however, I come to see each face quite clearly, lit up as if a spotlight played on it. I noticed a prison official seated at each end of no man's land between the grilles. The native prisoners and their relations on the other side were squatting opposite each other. They didn't raise their voices and, in spite of the din, managed to converse about almost in a whisper. This murmur of voices coming from below made a sort of accompaniment to the conversation going on above their heads. I took stock of all this very quickly and moved a step forward towards Marie. She was pressing her brown suntan face to the bars and smiling as hard as she could. I thought she was looking very pretty, but somehow I couldn't bring myself to tell her so. "Well?" she asked, pitching her voice very high. "What about it? Are you all right? Have you everything you want?" "Ah, yes, I have everything I want." We were silent for some moments. Marie went on smiling. The fat woman was bawling at the prisoner beside me, her husband presumably, a tall, fair, pleasant-looking man. "Jean refused to have him," she yelled. "That's just too bad." "That's just too bad," the man replied. "Yes, and I told her you'd take him back the moment you get out, but she wouldn't hear of it." Marie shouted across the gap that Raymond sent me his best wishes, and I said, "Thanks," but my voice was drowned out by my neighbours talking, or asking, if he was quite fit. The fat woman gave a laugh. "Fit? I should say he is, the picture of health." Meanwhile, the prisoner on my left, a youngster with thin girlish hands, never said a word. His eyes, I noticed, were fixed on the little old woman opposite him, and she returned his gaze with a sort of hungry passion. But I had to stop looking at them, as Marie was shouting to me that we mustn't lose hope. "Certainly not," I answered. My gaze fell on her shoulder, and I had a sudden longing to squeeze them through the dress, a thin dress. Its silky texture fascinated me, and I had a feeling that the hope she spoke of centered on it somehow. I imagined something of the same sort was in Mary's mind, for she went on smiling, looking straight at me. "And Lord come right, you'll see, and then we shall get married." All I could see of her now were the white flash of her teeth and the little puckers round her eyes. I answered, "Do you really think so?" But chiefly because I felt it was up to me to answer something. She started talking very fast in the same high-pitched voice. "Yes, you'll be acquainted and we'll go bathing again on Sundays." The woman beside Marie was still yelling away, telling her husband that she left the basket for him in the prison office. She gave a list of the things she brought and told him to mind to check them carefully, as some would cost quite a lot. The youngster on my other side and his mother were still gazing mournfully at each other, and the murmur of the Arabs droned on below us. The light outside seemed to be surging up against the windows, seeping through and smearing the faces of the people facing it with a coat of yellow oil. I began to feel slightly squeamish and wished I could leave. The strident voice beside me was jarring on my ears, but on the other hand I wanted to have the most I could of Mary's company. I have no idea how much time passed. I remember Marie's describing to me her work, with that set smile always on her face. There weren't a moment's let up in the noise, shouts, conversation, and always that muttering undertone. The only oases of silence were made by the young fellow and the old dame gazing into each other's eyes. Oh, and we'll do an ad break in 15 seconds, so I will pause there. Let it play out so that you don't miss it if you're following along at home. I'll take a moment to have another drink. I always seem to underestimate how much strain this sort of thing will put on my throat. Admittedly, this is a little worse than I'd expected. I mean, normally I'm not feeling too badly until about 3 or 4 hours into it. We've only been going the 2. But then, it's been a bit dry around here lately. And I haven't been having my lozenges as regular, so perhaps that's it. I did some music, would have been the day before yesterday, so maybe I put some strain there too. Who can say, really? Might just be the dust too. This put me in one of the deeper stacks. It's a little bit the worse for dust and mould and such. Bit of a funk to it, so might be that there's something on it that's getting to my throat as well. Still, I hope to finish it. We should be... Well, we're currently on page 329, and it runs just around about 100, I think, more or less. A little less than that. So, 329, what am I talking about? We're on page 52. And it stretches 87, so we're 52 pages into it and there's 35 to go, so probably we've got about an hour left, maybe an hour and change. So we'll try and I think we can get through it. An hour more shouldn't do me too much harm. Which is actually about what I was hoping to do, really, 3 hours. So that's pretty good. Might run to 3.5, but I think that's still within tolerance. I want to go out with Ivy while she does Strop's thing. So that'll be good. That'll be good. And that should be the outbreak ended. At least as long as the robot isn't lying to me, which of course we know that it is, but who can say? Anyhow, we'll press on. The only oasis of silence were made by the young fellow and the old dame gazing into each other's eyes. Then one by one the Arabs were led away. Almost everyone fell silent when the final one left. The little old woman pressed herself against the bars, and at the same moment a warder tapped her son's shoulder. He called, "Au revoir, mother," and slowly slipping her hand between the bars, she gave him a small, slow wave with it. No sooner was she gone than a man, that in hand, took her place. A prisoner was led up to the empty place beside me, and the two started a brisk exchange of remarks. Not loud, however, as the room had become relatively quiet. Someone come and called away the man on my right, and his wife shouted at him. She didn't seem to realise it was no longer necessary to shout. "Now mind you look after yourself, dear, and don't do anything rash." My turn come next. Marie threw me a kiss. I looked back as I walked away. She still hadn't moved. Her face was still pressed to the rails, her lips still parted in that tense, twisted smile. Soon after this I had a letter from her, and it were then that the things I've never liked to talk of that began. Not that they were particularly terrible. I've no risk to exaggerate, and I suffered less than others. Still, there were one thing in those early days that were really irksome. My habit of thinking like a free man. For instance, I would suddenly be seized with a desire to go down to the beach for a swim, and merely to have imagined the sound of ripples at my feet, and then the smooth feel of the water in my body as I struck out, and the wonderful sensation of relief it gave, brought home still more cruelly the narrowness of my cell. Still, that phase lasted a few months only. Afterwards I had prisoner's thoughts. I waited for the daily walk in the courtyard, or visit from my lawyer. As for the rest of the time I managed quite well, really. I've often thought that had I been compelled to live in the trunk of a dead tree, with nothing to do but gaze up at the patch of sky just overhead, I'd have got used to it by degrees. I'd have learned to watch for the passing of the birds or drifting clouds, as I'd come to watch for my lawyer's old neckties, or in another world, to wait patiently till Sunday for a spell of love-making with Marie. Well, here anyhow I wasn't penned in a hollow tree trunk. There are others in the world worse off than I was. I remember that it had been one of Mother's pet ideas. She was always voicing it. In the long run one gets used to anything. Usually, however, I didn't think of things out so far. Those first months were trying, of course, but the very effort I had to make helped me through them. For instance, I was plagued by the desire for a woman, which were natural enough considering my age. I never thought of Marie especially. I was obsessed by thoughts of this woman, or that, of all the ones I had, all the circumstances under which I'd loved them, so much as so that the cell grew crowded with their faces, ghosts of my old passions. That unsettled me, no doubt, but at least it served to kill time. I gradually became quite friendly with the chief gaoler, who went on the rounds with the kitchen hands at meal times. It was he who brought up the subject of women. That's the men he'd grumble about most, he told me. I said I felt like that myself. There's something unfair about it, I added, like hitting a man when he's down. That's the whole point of it, he said. That's why you fellows are kept in prison. I don't follow. Liberty, he said, means that you're being deprived of your liberty. It never before struck me in that light, but I saw his point. That's true, I said. Otherwise it wouldn't be a punishment. The gaoler nodded. Yes, you're different. You can use your brains. The others can't. Till those fellows find a way out, they do it by themselves. For which remark the gaoler left my cell. Next day I did like the others. The lack of cigarettes, too, were a trial. When I was brought to the prison, they took away my belt, my shoelaces, and the contents of my pockets, including my cigarettes. Once I had been given a cell to myself, I asked to be given back any other cigarettes. Smoking was forbidden, they informed me. That, perhaps, was what got me down the most. In fact, I suffered really badly during the first few days. I even tore off splinters from my plank bed and sucked them. All day long I felt faint and bilious. It passed my understanding why I shouldn't be allowed even to smoke. It couldn't have done anyone no harm. Later on I understood the idea behind it. This privation too were part of my punishment. But by the time I understood I'd lost the craving, so it ceased to be a punishment. Except for the privations, I wasn't too unhappy. Yet again the old problem was how to kill time. After a while, however, once I'd learnt the trick of remembering things, I never had a moment's boredom. Sometimes I would exercise my memory on my bedroom, and starting in from the corner, make the round, noting every object I saw on the way. At first it were over in a minute or two, but each time I repeated the experience it took a little longer. I made a point of visualising every piece of furniture and each article upon it, or in it, and then every detail about each article, and finally the details of the details, so to speak. a tiny dent or incrustation, or a chipped edge, the exact grain and colour of the woodwork. At the same time, I forced myself to keep my inventory in my mind from start to finish in the right order and omitting no item. With the result that, after a few weeks, I could spend hours merely enlisting objects in my bedroom. I found that the more I thought, the more details I'd forgotten or malobserved floated up from my memory. There seemed no end to them. So I learned that even after a single day's experience of the outside world, a man could easily live 100 years in prison. He'd have laid up enough memories to never be bored. Obviously, in one way, this were a compensation. Then there was sleep. To begin with, I slept badly at night, and there in the day. But gradually my nights became better, and I managed to doze off in the daytime as well. In fact, during the last months, I must have slept 16 or 18 hours out of every 24. So there remained only 6 hours to fill, with meals, relieving nature, my memories, and the story of the check. One day, when inspecting my straw mattress, I found a bit of newspaper stuck to its underside. The paper were yellow with age, almost transparent, but one could still make out the letterprint. It was the story of a crime. The first part were missing. One gathered that the scene was some village in Czechoslovakia. One of the villagers had left his home to try his luck abroad. After 25 years, having made a fortune, he returned to his country with a wife and child. Meanwhile, his mother and sister had been running a small hotel in the village where he was born. He decided to give him a surprise and, leaving his wife and child in another inn, he went to stay at his mother's place, booking a room under an assumed name. His mother and sister completely failed to recognise him. At dinner that evening, he showed them a large sum of money he had on him, and in the course of the night they slaughtered him with an hammer. After taking the money, they flung the body in the river. Next morning, his wife came home without thinking, betrayed the guest's identity. His mother hanged herself. His sister threw herself into a well. I must have read that story thousands of times. In one way it sounded most unlikely, in another it was plausible enough. Anyhow, to my mind, the man were asking for trouble. One shouldn't play full tricks of that sort. So what with the long bouts of sleep, my memories, readings of that scrap of newspaper, the tides of light and darkness, the days slipped by. I'd read, of course, that in jail one ends up losing track of time. But this never meant anything definite to me. I hadn't grasped how days could be at once long and short. Long, no doubt, as periods to live through, but so distended that they ended up overlapping on each other. In fact, I never thought of days as such. Only the words yesterday and tomorrow still kept some meaning. When one morning the warder informed me I had now been 6 months in jail, I believed him, but the words conveyed nothing to my mind. To me it seemed like one and the same day that had been going on since I'd been in my cell, and I'd been doing the same thing all the time. After the jailer left me, I shined up my tin pannikin and studied my face in it. My expression was terribly serious, I thought, even when I tried to smile. I held the pannikin at different angles, but always my face had the same mournful, tense expression. The sun was setting, and it was the hour at which I'd rather not speak. A nameless hour, I called it, when evening sounds were creeping up from all the floors of the prison in a sort of stealthy procession. I went to the barred windows, and in the last rays looked once again at my reflected face. It was just as serious as before, and that wasn't surprising, as just then I was feeling serious. At the same time I heard something I hadn't heard for months. It was the sound of a voice, my own voice, there was no mistaking it, and I recognised it as the voice that for many days of late had been buzzing in my ears. So I knew that all this time I'd been talking to myself. And something I'd been told come back to me, a remark made by the nurse at Mother's funeral. No, there were no way out, and no one can imagine what the evenings are like in prison. That's the end of chapter 2. Have a quick drink. Chapter 3. On the whole, I can't say that those months passed slowly. Another summer on its way almost before I realised the first were over. And I knew that with the first really hot days, something new was in store for me. My case was down for the last session of the Assize Court, and that session was due to end sometime in June. The day on which my trial started was one of brilliant sunshine. My lawyer assured me the case would take only 2 or 3 days. From what I heard, he added, the court will dispatch your case as quickly as possible, as it isn't the most important one in the cause list. There's a case of patricide immediately after, it will take some time. They come for me at 7:30 in the morning, and I was conveyed to the law courts in the prison van. The two policemen led me into a small room that smelt of darkness. We sat near a door through which came sounds of voices, shouts, chairs scraping on the floor. A vague hubbub which reminded me of one of those small town socials, when after the concert's over the hall is cleared for dancing. One of my policemen told me the judge hadn't arrived yet and offered me a cigarette, which I declined. After a bit he asked me if I were feeling nervous. I said no. The prospect of witnessing a trial rather interested me. I never had occasion to attend one before. Maybe, our policeman said, but after an hour or two one's had enough of it. After a while a small electric bell purred in the room. They unfastened my handcuffs, opened the door and led me onto the prisoner's dock. There were a great crowd in the courtroom. Though the Venetian blinds were down, light were filtering through the chinks, and the air was stifling hot already. The windows had been kept shut. I sat down and the police officers took their stand on each side of my chair. It was then that I noticed a row of faces opposite me. These people were staring at me, hard at me, and I guessed they were the jury. But somehow I didn't see them as individuals. I felt as one died off the board in the tram, and one's consciousness of all the people on the opposite seat staring at one on the open, finding something in one's appearance to amuse them. Of course I knew this were an absurd comparison. What these people were looking for in me wasn't anything to laugh at, but signs of criminality. Still, the difference wasn't so very great, and anyhow, that's the idea I got. What with the crowd and the stuffiness of the air, I was feeling a bit dizzy. I ran my eyes around the courtroom, but I couldn't recognise any of the faces. At first I could hardly believe that all these people had come on my account. It was such a new experience, being a focus of interest in the ordinary way no one ever paid much attention to me. What a crush, I remarked to the policeman on my left, and he explained that the newspapers were responsible for it. He pointed to a group of men at a table just below the jury box. There they are. Who? I asked, and he replied, the press. One of them, he added, were an old friend of his. A moment later the man he'd mentioned looked our way, and coming up on the dock, shook hands warmly with the policeman. The journalists were an elderly man with a rather grim expression, but his manner was quite pleasant. Just then I noticed that almost all the people in the courtroom were greeting each other, exchanging remarks and forming groups. Behaving, in fact, as in a club where the company of others of one's own tastes and standing makes one feel at ease. That, no doubt, explained the odd impression I had of being de trop here, a sort of gatecrasher. However, the journalist addressed me quite amiably, and he said he hoped it would all go well for me. I thanked him, and he added with a smile, You know, we've been featuring you a bit. We're always rather short of copy in the summer, and there's been precious little to write about except your case and the one that's coming on after it. I expect you've heard about it, the case of patricide. He drew my attention to one of the group at the press table, a plump small man with huge black-trimmed glasses, who made one think of an overfed weasel. That chap's the special correspondent of one of the Paris dailies. As a matter of fact, he didn't come on your account. He was sent for the patricide case, but they've asked him to cover yours as well. It was on the tip of my tongue to say that was very kind of him, but then I thought it would sound silly. With a friendly wave of his hand, he left, and for some minutes nothing happened. Then, accompanied by some colleagues, my lawyer bustled in his gown. He went up to the press table and shook hands with the journalists. They remained laughing and chatting together, all seemingly very much at home here, until a bell rang shrilly and everyone went to his place. My lawyer came up to me, shook hands, and advised me to answer all the questions as briefly as possible, not to volunteer information, and to rely on him to see me through. I heard a chair scrape off on my left, and a tall thin man wearing pince-nez sat with the folds of his red gown as he took his seat. The public prosecutor, I gathered. A clerk of the court announced that their honours were entering, and at the same moment 2 big electric fans started buzzing overhead. 3 judges, 2 in black and the 3rd in scarlet with a briefcase under their arms, entered and walked briskly to the bench, which was several feet above the level of the courtroom floor. The man in scarlet took the central black chair, placed his cap of office on the table, ran an handkerchief over his small bold crown, and announced that the hearing would now begin. The journalists had their fountain pens ready. They all wore the same expression of slightly ironical indifference, with the exception of one, a much younger man than his colleagues, in grey flannels with a blue tie, who, leaving his pen on the table, were gazing hard at me. He had a plain, rather chunky face. What held my attention were his eyes, very pale, clear eyes, riveted on me, though not betraying any definite emotions. For a moment I had an odd impression, as if I were being scrutinised by myself. That, and the fact that I were unfamiliar with court procedure, may explain why I didn't follow very well the opening phrases, the drawing of lots for the jury, the various questions put by the presiding judge to the prosecutor, the foreman of the jury and my counsel, Each time he spoke, all the jurymen's heads swung round together, forward to the bench. The arid reading of the charge sheet, in the course of which I recognised some familiar names of people and places, and some supplementary questions to put to my lawyer. Next, the judge announced that the court would call over the witness list. Some of the names read out by the clerk rather surprised me. From among the crowd, which until now I had seen a mere blur of faces, rose one after another: Raymond, Masson, Salmana, the doorkeeper from the home, old Perez and Marie, who gave me a little nervous wave of her hand before following the others out by a side door. I was thinking how strange it were that I hadn't noticed any of them before, when I heard the last name called, that of Celeste. As he rose, I noticed beside him the quaint little woman with a mannish coat and brisk, decided air, who had shared my table at the restaurant. She had her eyes fixed on me, I noticed, but I hadn't done the wonder about her. The judge had started speaking again. He said that the trial proper were about to begin, and he need hardly say that he expected the public to refrain from any demonstration whatsoever. He explained that he was there to supervise the proceedings as a sort of umpire, and he would take a scrupulously impartial view of the case. The verdict of the jury would be interpreted by him in a spirit of justice. Finally, at the least sign of disturbance, he would have the court cleared. The day was stoken up. Some of the public were fanning themselves with newspapers, and there was a constant rustle of crumpled paper. On a sign from the presiding judge, the clerk of the court brought 3 fans of plated straw, which the 3 judges promptly put in action. My examination began at once. The judge questioned me quite calmly and even, I thought, with a hint of cordiality. For the nth time, I was asked to give particulars of my identity, and though heartily sick of this formality, I realised that it were natural enough. After all, it would be a shocking thing for the court to be trying the wrong man. The judge then launched into an account of what I'd done, stopping every 2 or 3 sentences to ask me, "Is that correct?" Which I always replied, "Yes, sir," as my lawyer had advised me. It were a long business. The judge lingered on each detail. Meanwhile, the journalist scribbled hastily away, but I was sometimes conscious of the eyes of the younger fixed on me, also those of the queer little robot woman. The jurymen, however, were all gazing at the rogue judge, and I were again reminded of the row of passengers in one side of a tram. Presently he gave a slight cough, turned some pages in his file, and, still fanning his face, addressed me gravely. He now proposed, he said, to touch on certain matters which, on a superficial view, might seem foreign to the case, but actually were highly relevant. I guessed that he were going to talk about Mother, and at the same moment realised how odious I would find this. His first question was, why had I sent my mother to an institution? I replied that the reason was simple. I hadn't enough money to see that she was properly looked after at home. Then he asked if the partner hadn't caused me distress. I explained that neither Mother nor I expected much of one another, or for that matter of anyone else, so both of us had got used to the new conditions easily enough. The judge then said he had no wish to press the point, and asked the prosecutor if he could think of any more questions that should be put to me at this stage. The prosecutor, who had his back half turned to me, said without looking in my direction that, subject to his Honour's approval, he would like to know if I had gone back to the stream with the intention of killing the Arab. I said no. In that case, why had I taken a revolver with me, and why go back precisely to that spot? I said it were a matter of pure chance. The prosecutor then observed in a nasty tone, "Very good, that'll be all for the present." I couldn't quite follow what come next. Anyhow, after some palavering between the bench, the prosecutor and my counsel, the presiding judge announced the court would now rise. There was an adjournment till the afternoon, when evidence would be taken. Almost before I knew what were happening, I was rushed out to the prison van, which drove me back, and I was given my midday meal. After a short time, just enough for me to realise how tired I was feeling, they come for me. I was back in the same room, confronting the same faces. The whole thing started again. But the heat had meanwhile much increased, and by some miracle friends had been produced for everyone. The jury, my lawyer, the prosecutor, and some of the pressmen too. The young man and the robot woman were still at their places. They were not fanning themselves, and, as before, they never took their eyes off me. I wiped the sweat from my face, but I was barely conscious of where or who I was until I heard the warden of the home called to the witness box. When asked if my mother had complained about my conduct, he said, "Yes." That didn't mean much. Almost all the inmates of the house had grievances against their relatives. The judge asked him to be more explicit. Did she reproach me with having sent her to the home? And he answered, "Yes," again, but this time he didn't qualify his answer. To another question, he replied that on the day of the funeral he was somewhat surprised by my calmness. Asked to explain what he meant by my calmness, the warden lowered his eyes and stared at his shoes for a moment. Then he explained that I hadn't wanted to see Mother's body, or shed a single tear, and I left immediately. I had left immediately the funeral ended, without lingering at her grave. Another thing had surprised him. One of the undertaker's men told him that I didn't know my mother's age. There was a short silence, then the judge asked him if he might take it that he were referring to the prisoner in the dock. The warden seemed puzzled by this, and the judge explained, "It's a formal question, I'm bound to put it." The prosecutor was then asked if he had any questions to put, and he answered loudly, "Certainly not, I have all I want." His tone and the look of triumph on his face as he glanced at me was so marked that I felt I hadn't felt for ages. I had a foolish desire to burst into tears. For the first time I realised how all these people loathed me. After asking the jury and my lawyers if they had any questions, the judge heard the doorkeeper's evidence. On stepping into the box, the man threw a glance at me, then looked away. Replying to questions, he said that I'd declined to see mother's body. I'd smoked cigarettes and slept and drunk café au lait. But then I felt a sort of wave of indignation spreading through the courtroom, and for the first time I understood that I was guilty. They got the doorkeeper to repeat what he had said about the coffee and my smoking. The prosecutor turned to me again with a gloating look in his eyes. My counsel asked the doorkeeper if, too, he hadn't smoked. But the prosecutor took strong exception to this. "I'd like to know," he cried indignantly, "who is on trial in this court? Or does my friend think that by aspersing the witness for the persecution he will shake the evidence, the abundant and cognate evidence against his client?" Nonetheless, the judge told the doorkeeper to answer the question. The old fellow fidgeted a bit, then, "Well, I don't know, I didn't ought to have done it," he mumbled, "but I did take a fag from the young gentleman when he offered it, just out of politeness." The judge asked me if I had any comment to make. "None," I said, "except that the witness is quite right. It's true, I offered him a cigarette." The doorkeeper looked at me with surprise and a sort of gratitude. Then, after umming and ahhing for a little bit, he volunteered the statement that it was he who suggested that I should have some coffee. My lawyer was exultant. "The jury will appreciate," he said, "the importance of this admission." The prosecutor, however, was promptly on his feet again. "Quite so," he boomed above our heads. "The jury will appreciate it, and they will draw the conclusion that, though a third party might inadvertently offer him a cup of coffee, the prisoner, in common decency, should have refused it, if only out of respect for the dead body of the poor woman who had brought him into the world." After which the doorkeeper went back to his seat. And Thomas Perez was called up. A court officer had to help him to the box. Perez stated that, though he had been a great friend of my mother, he had met me only once, on the day of the funeral. Asked how I behaved that day, he said, "Well, I was most upset, you know. Far too much upset to notice things. My grief sort of blinded me. I think it had been a great shock, my dear friend's death. In fact, I fainted during the funeral, so I didn't hardly notice the young gentleman at all." The prosecutor asked him to tell the court if he'd seen me weep. And when Perez answered, "No," added emphatically, "I trust the jury will take note of this reply." My lawyer rose at once and asked Perez, in a tone that seemed to me needlessly aggressive, "Now think well, man, can you swear you saw he didn't shed a tear?" Perez answered, "No." At this some people tittered, and my lawyer, pushing back one sleeve of his gown, said sternly, "That is typical of the way this case is being conducted. No attempt is being made to elicit the true facts." The prosecutor ignored this remark. He was making dabs with his pencil on the cover of his brief, seemingly quite indifferent. There were a break of 5 minutes, during which my lawyer told me the case was going very well indeed. And Celeste was called. He renounced as a witness for the defence. The defence meant me. Now and again Celeste threw me a glance. He kept squeezing his Panama hat between his hands, and he gave evidence. He wore in his best suit, the one he wore when sometimes of a Sunday he went with me to one of the races. But evidently he hadn't been able to get his collar on. The top of his shirt, I noticed, was secured only by a brass stud. Asked if I was one of his customers, he said, "Yes, and a friend as well." Asked to state his opinion of me, he said that I was all right, and when told to explain what he meant by that, he replied that everyone knew what that meant. Was I a secretive sort of man? No, they answered. I shouldn't call him that. But he doesn't want to waste his breath, like a lot of folks. The prosecutor asked him if I always sat with my monthly bill at his restaurant when he presented it. Celeste laughed. "Oh, he paid on the nail alert, but the bills were just details, like, between him and me." Then he was asked to say what he thought about the crime. He placed his hands on the rail of the box, and one could see he had a speech already. "To my mind it was just an accident, or a stroke of bad luck if you prefer. And a thing like that takes you off your guard." He wanted to continue, but the judge cut him short. "Quite so, that's all, thank you." For a bit Celeste seemed flabbergasted. Then he explained that he hadn't finished, but what he wanted to say. They told him to continue, but to make it brief. He only repeated that it was just an accident. That is as may be, the judge observed. What we are here for is to try such accidents according to law. You can stand down. Celeste turned and gazed at me. His eyes were moist and his lips trembling. It was exactly as he said. Well, I've done my best for you, old chap, and I'm afraid that hasn't helped much. I'm sorry. I didn't say anything or make any movement. For the first time in my life, I wanted to kiss her, ma'am. The judge repeated his order to stand down, and Celeste returned to his place among the crowd. During the rest of the hearing, he remained there, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, and his panorama between his hands, not missing a word of the proceedings. It was Marie's turn next. She had an hat on, and still looked quite pretty. I much preferred her with her hair free. From where I was, I had glimpses of the soft curves of her breasts, and her under lip had the little pout that always fascinated me. She appeared very nervous. The first question was, how long had she known me? Since the time when she was in her office, she replied. And the judge asked her what were relations between us, and she said she was my girlfriend. Answering another question, she admitted promising to marry me. The prosecutor, who had been studying a document in front of him, asked her rather sharply when our liaison had begun. She gave the date. He then observed with a would-be casual air that apparently she meant the day following my mother's funeral. After letting this sink in, he remarked in a slightly ironic tone that obviously this was a delicate topic, and he could enter into the young lady's feelings, but, and here his voice was sterner, his duty obliged him to waive considerations of delicacy. After making this announcement, he asked Marie to give full account of our doings on the day which I was on the day when I had intercourse with her for the first time. Mary wouldn't answer at first, but the prosecutor insisted, and then she told him we had met at the bar, gone together to the pictures, and then to my place. He then informed the court that, as a result of certain statements made by Marie at the proceedings before the magistrate, he had studied the cinema programmes of that date, and, turning to Marie, asked her to name the film that we had gone to see. In a very low voice, she said it was a picture with Fernandel in it. By the time she had finished, the courtroom was so still you could have heard a pin drop. Looking very grave, the prosecutor drew himself up to his full eye, and, pointing at me, said in such a tone that I could have sworn he was genuinely moved, "Gentlemen of the jury, I would have you note that on the next day after his mother's funeral, that man was visiting the swimming pool, starting a liaison with a girl, and going to see a comic film. That is all I wish to say." When he sat down, there was the same dead silence. Then all of a sudden Marie burst into tears. He got it all wrong, she said. It wasn't a bit like that, really. He'd bullied her into saying the opposite of what she meant. She knew me very well, and she was sure I hadn't done anything really wrong, and so on. Aside from the presiding judge, one of the court officers led her away, and the hearing continued. Hardly anyone seemed to listen to Masson, the next witness. He stated that I was a respectable young fellow, and what's more, a very decent chap. Nor did they pay any more attention to Salamana when he told them how kind I'd always been to his dog, or when in answer to a question about my mother and myself, he said that really, Mother and I had very little in common, and that explained why I fixed up for her to go enter their own. You've got to understand, he added. You've got to understand. But no one seemed to understand. You were told to stand down. Raymond was the next and last witness. He gave me a little wave of his hand, and led off by saying I were innocent. The judge rebuked him. You are here to give evidence, not your views in the case, and you must confine yourself to answering the questions put to you. You were then asked to make clear his relation with the deceased, and Raymond took this opportunity explaining that it was he, not I, against whom the dead man had a grudge, because he, Raymond, had beaten up his sister. The judge asked him if the deceased had no reason to dislike me too. Raymond told him that my presence on the beach that morning was pure coincidence. How comes it then, the prosecutor inquired, that the letter which led up to this tragedy was the prisoner's work? Raymond replied that too was due to mere chance, which the prosecutor assured in this case, chance, or mere coincidence, seems to play a remarkably large part. Was it by chance that I hadn't intervened when Raymond assaulted his mistress? This convenient term chance accounts for my having vouched for Raymond at the police station after having made on that occasion statements extravagantly favourable to him. In conclusion, he asked Raymond to state what were his means of livelihood. On his describing himself as a warehouseman, the prosecution informed the jury it was common knowledge that the witness lived on the immoral earnings of women. I, he said, was this man's intimate friend and associate. In fact, the whole background of the crime were of this most squalid description, and what made it even more odious was the personality of the prisoner, an inhuman monster wholly without moral sense. Raymond began to expostulate, and my lawyer rose too, protested. They were told that the prosecutor must be allowed to finish his remarks. I have nearly done, he said, and then turned to Raymond. Was the prisoner your friend? Certainly, with the best of pals, as they say. The prosecution then put me the same question. I looked hard at Raymond, and he did not turn away. Then, yes, I answered. The prosecutor turned towards the jury. Not only did the man before you in the dock indulge in the most shameful orgies on the day following his mother's funeral, he killed a man cold-bloodedly in pursuance of some sordid vendetta in the underworld of prostitutes and pimps. That, gentlemen of the jury, is the type of man the prisoner is. No sooner had he sat down than my lawyer, out of all patience, raised his arm so high that his sleeves fell back, showing the full length of his starched shirt cuffs. "Is my client on trial for having buried his mother or for killing a man?" he asked. There were some titters in court, but then the prosecution sprang to his feet and, draping his gown round him, said he were amazed at his friend's ingenuousness in failing to see that between these two elements of the case there were a vital link. They hung together psychologically, if he might put it so. In short, he concluded, speaking with great vehemence, I accused the prisoner of behaving at his mother's funeral in a way that showed he was already a criminal at heart. These words seemed to make much effect on the jury and public. My lawyer merely shrugged his shoulders and wiped the sweat from his forehead. But obviously he was rattled, and I had a feeling things weren't going too well for me. Soon after this incident, the court rose. As I were being taken from the courthouse to the prison van, I was conscious for a few brief moments of the once familiar feel of a summer evening out of doors. And sitting in the darkness of my moving cell, I recognised, echoing in my tired brain, all the characteristic sounds of a town I'd loved, and a certain hour of the day which I had always particularly enjoyed. The shouts of newspaper boys in the already languid air, the last calls of birds in the public garden, the cries of sandwich vendors, the screech of trams at the steep corners of the upper town, and that faint rustling overhead as darkness sifted down upon the arbour. All these sounds made my return to prison like a blind man's journey along a route whose every inch he knows by heart. Yes, this was the evening hour when, how long ago it seemed, I always felt so well content with life. Then what awaited me were a night of easy dreamless sleep. This was the same hour, but with a difference. I returned into a cell, and what awaited me were a night haunted by forebodings of the coming day. And so I learnt that familiar paths traced in the dusk of summer evenings may lead as well to prison as to innocent, carefree sleep. That's the end of chapter 3 of part 2. I have my little drink. Chapter 4. It is always interesting, even in the prisoner's dock, to hear oneself being talked about. And certainly in the speeches of my lawyer and the prosecuting counsel, a great deal was said about me. More in fact about me personally than about my crime. Really, there wasn't any great difference between the two speeches. Counsel for the defence raised his arms to heaven and pleaded guilty, but with extenuating circumstances. The prosecutor made a similar gestures. He agreed that I was guilty, but denied extenuating circumstances. One thing about this phase of the trial was rather irksome. Quite often, interested as I was in what they had to say, I was tempted to put in words myself, but my lawyer had advised me not to. You won't do your case any good by talking, he had warned me. In fact, there seemed to be a conspiracy to exclude me from the proceedings. I wasn't to have any say, and my fate would be decided out of hand. It was quite an effort at times for me to refrain from cutting them all short and saying, "But damn it all, who's on trial in this court? I'd like to know. It's a serious matter for a man being accused of murder. I have something really important to tell you." However, on second thoughts, I found that I had nothing to say. In any case, I must admit that hearing oneself talked about loses its interest very soon. The prosecutor's speech especially began to bore me before we were halfway through it. The only thing that really caught my attention were occasional phrases, its gestures, and some elaborate tirades. But these were isolated patches. What he were aiming at, I gathered, was to show that my crime was premeditated. I remember his saying at one moment, "I can prove this, gentlemen of the jury, to the hilt. First you have the facts of the crime, which are as clear as daylight, and then you have what I may call the night side of the case, the dark workings of a criminal mentality." He began by summing up the facts from my mother's death onwards. He stressed my heartlessness, my inability to state mother's age, my visit to the bathing pool where I met Marie, our matinee at the picture where Fernandel film was snowing, and finally my return with Marie to my rooms. I didn't quite follow his remarks at first, as he kept on mentioning the prisoner's mistress, whereas for me she was just Marie. Then he came to the subject of Raymond. It seemed to me that his way of treating the facts showed a certain shrewdness. All he said sounded quite plausible. I'd written the letter in collusion with Raymond so as to entice his mistress to his room, and subject her to ill treatment by a man of more than dubious reputation. Then on the beach I'd provoked a brawl with Raymond's enemies, in the course of which Raymond were wounded. I'd asked him for his revolver and gone back myself with the intention of using it. Then I'd shot the Arab. After the first shot I waited, then, to be certain of making a good job of it, I fired 4 more shots, deliberately, point blank and in cold blood at my victim. That is my case, he said. I have described to you the series of events which led this man to kill the deceased, fully aware of what he was doing. I emphasize this point. We are not concerned with an act of homicide committed on a sudden impulse which might serve as an extenuation. I ask you to note, gentlemen of the jury, that the prisoner is an educated man. You will have observed the way in which he answered my question. He is intelligent and he knows the value of words, and I repeat that it is quite impossible to assume that when he committed the crime, he was unaware of what he was doing. I noticed that you laid stress on my intelligence. It puzzled me rather why what I would count as a good point in an ordinary person should be used against an accused man as an overwhelming proof of his guilt. While thinking this over, I missed what he next said, until I heard him exclaim indignantly, "And has he uttered a word of regret for his most odious crime? Not one word, gentlemen, not one in the course of these proceedings did this man show the least contrition." Turned towards the dock, he pointed a finger at me, and went on in the same strain. I really couldn't understand why he harped on this point so much. Of course I had to own that you were right. I didn't feel much regret for what I'd done. Still, with my mind he overdid it, and I'd like to have a chance to explain to him in quite friendly, almost affectionate way, that I'd never been really able to regret anything at all in my life. I've always been far too much absorbed in the present moment, or the immediate future, to think back. Of course, in the position into which I'd been forced, there were no question of my speaking to anyone in that time. I hadn't the right to show any friendly feeling or possess good intentions. I tried to follow what came next, as the prosecutor were now considering what he called my soul. He said he'd studied it closely, and had found a blank. Literally nothing, gentlemen of the jury. Really, he said, I had no soul. There was nothing human about me, not one of those mortal qualities which a normal person could possess at any place in my mentality. No doubt, he added, we should not reproach him with this. We cannot blame a man for lacking what it was never in his power to acquire. But in a criminal court, the wholly passive ideal of tolerance must be given place of a sterner, loftier ideal, that of justice, especially when this lack of every decent instinct is such that the man before you is a menace to society. He proceeded to discuss my conduct towards my mother, repeating what he had said in the course of the hearing, but he spoke at a much greater length of my crime, at such length indeed that I lost a thread, and was conscious only of the steadily increasing heat. A moment come when the prosecutor paused, and after a short silence, said in a low, vibrant voice, "The same court, gentlemen, will be called on to try tomorrow this most odious of crimes, the murder of a father by his son." To his mind such a crime were almost unimaginable, but he ventured to hope. Justice would be meted out without faltering. And yet he made bold to say the horror that even that crime of patricide inspired in him paled beside the loathing inspired by my callousness. This man, who is morally guilty of his mother's death, is no less unfit to have a place in the community than the other man who did death to his father who begat him. And indeed the one crime led on to the other. The first of these two criminals, the man in the dock, set a precedent, if I may put it so, and authorized the second crime. Yes, gentlemen, I am convinced, here he raised his voice a tone, that you will not find I am exaggerating the case against the prisoner when I say he is also guilty of the murder to be tried tomorrow in this court, and I look to you for a verdict accordingly. The prosecutor paused again to wipe the sweat off his face. Then he explained that his duty were a painful one, that he would do it without flinching. This man has, I repeat, no place in the community whose basic principle he flouts without compunction, nor, heartless as he is, has he any claim to mercy. I ask you to oppose the extreme penalty of the law, and ask it without qualm. In the course of a long career, in which it has often been my duty to ask for a capital sentence, never have I felt that painful duty weigh so little on my mind as in the present case. In demanding a verdict of murder without extenuating circumstances, I am following not only the dictates of my conscience and sacred obligation, but also those of natural and righteous indignation I feel in the sight of a criminal devoid of the least spark of human feeling. When the prosecutor sat down, there was a longish silence. Personally, I was quite overcome by my amazement at what I had been hearing. The presiding judge gave a short cough, and asked me in a very low tone if I had anything to say. I rose, and, as I felt in the mood to speak, I said the first thing that crossed my mind. I had no intention of killing the Arab. The judge replied that statement would be taken into consideration by the court. Meanwhile, he would be glad to hear, before my counsel addressed the court, what were the motives of my crime. So far, he must admit, he hadn't fully understood the grounds of my defence. I tried to explain that it was because of the son, but I spoke too quickly and ran my words into each other. I was only too conscious that it sounded nonsensical, and in fact I heard people tittering. My lawyer shrugged his shoulders. Then he was directed to address the court in his turn. All he did was to talk out the lateness of the hour and to ask for an adjournment till the following afternoon. At this the judge agreed. When I was brought back in the next day, the electric fans were still churning up the heavy air, and the jurymen playing their gaudy little fans in a sort of steady rhythm. The speech for the defence seemed to me interminable. At one moment, however, I pricked up my ears. It was when I heard him saying, "It is true I killed the man." He went on the same strain, saying "I" when he referred to me. It seemed so queer that I bent towards the policeman on my right and asked him to explain. He told me to shut up, and after a moment whispered, "They'll do that." It seemed the idea behind it was to still further exclude me from the case, to put me off the map, so to speak, by substituting the lawyer for myself. Anyway, it hardly mattered. I already felt words away from this courtroom and its tedious proceedings. My lawyer, in any case, struck me as feeble to the point of being ridiculous. He hurried through his plea of provocation, and then he too started about my soul. I had an impression that he had much less talent than the prosecutor. "I too," he said, "have closely studied this man's soul. But unlike my learned friend here from the prosecution, I have found something there. Indeed, I must say that I have read the prisoner's mind like an open book. What he had read there was that I was an excellent young fellow, a steady, conscientious worker who did his best by his employer, that was popular with everyone unsympathetic in others' troubles. According to him, I was a dutiful son who had supported his mother as long as he were able. After anxious consideration, I had reached the conclusion that by entering home, the old lady would have comforts that my means didn't permit me to provide for her. I am astounded, gentlemen," he added, "by the attitude taken up by my learned friend in referring to this home. Surely, if proof be needed of the excellency of such institutions, we need only remember that they are promoted and financed by a government department. I noted that he made no reference to the funeral, and this seemed to me a serious omission. But with his long-windedness, the endless days and hours they had been discussing my soul, and the rest of it, I found that my mind was gone blurred. Everything was dissolving into a greyish, watery haze. Only one incident stands out. Towards the end, while my counsel rambled on, I heard the tin trumpet of an ice cream vendor in the street. A small shrill sound cutting across the flow of words, and then a rush of memories went through my mind. Memories of life which were mine no longer, and had once provided me with the surest, humblest pleasures. Warm smells of summer, my favourite streets, the sky at evening, Marie's dresses and her laugh. The futility of what was happening to her seemed to take me by the throat. I felt like vomiting, and I had only one idea: to get it over, go back to my cell and sleep. Dimly I heard my counsel making his last appeal. "Gentlemen of the jury, surely you will not send to his death a decent, hard-working young man because for one tragic moment he lost his self-control. Is he not sufficiently punished by the lifelong remorse that is to be his lot? I confidently await your verdict, the only verdict possible, that of homicide with extenuating circumstances." The court rose and the lawyer sat down, looking thoroughly exhausted. Some of his colleagues came up to him and shook his hand. "You put up a magnificent show, old chap," I heard one of them say. Another lawyer even called me to witness. "Fine, wasn't it?" I agreed, but insincerely. I was far too tired to judge if it had been fine or otherwise. Meanwhile, the day were ending, and the heat becoming less intense. By some vague sounds that reached me from the street, I knew that the call of the evening had set in. We all sat on waiting, and what we were all waiting for really concerned nobody but me. I looked round the courtroom. It was exactly as it had been on the first day. I met the eyes of the journalist in grey and the robot woman. They reminded me that not once during the old era had I tried to catch Marie's eye. It wasn't that I'd forgotten her, only I was too preoccupied. I saw her now, seated between Celeste and Raymond. She gave me a little wave of her hand, as if to say, "At last." She was smiling, but I could tell that she was rather anxious. But my heart seemed turned to stone. I couldn't even return her smile. The judges come back to their seats. Someone read out at the jury very rapidly a string of questions. I caught the word here and there: murder, malice aforethought, provocation, extenuating circumstances. The jury went out, and I was taken to the little room where I had already waited. My lawyer came to see me. He was very talkative and showed more cordiality and confidence than ever before. He assured me that this would all go well, and I'd get off with a few years' imprisonment or transportation. I asked him what were the chances of getting the sentence quashed. He said there were no chance of that. He had not raised any point of law, as this were apt to prejudice the jury, and it was difficult to get a judgment quashed except on technical grounds. I saw his point and agreed. Looking at the matter dispassionately, I shared his view. Otherwise there would be no end to litigation. In any case, the lawyer said, you can appeal in the ordinary way, but I'm convinced the verdict will be favourable. We waited for quite a while, a good 3/4 of an hour I should say, and the bell rung. My lawyer left me saying, the foreman of the jury will read out the answer. You'll be called on after that to hear the judgments. Some doors banged. I heard people hurrying down flights of steps, but couldn't tell whether they were nearby or distant. Then I heard a voice drawing away in the courtroom. When the bell rang again and I stepped back into the dock, the silence of the courtroom closed in around me. With the silence came a queer sensation, when I noticed that for the first time the young journalist kept his eyes averted. I didn't look in Marie's direction. In fact, I had no time to look as the presiding judge had already started pronouncing a rigmarole the effect that, in the name of the French people, I was to be decapitated in some public place. It seemed to me then that I could interpret the look on the face of those present. It was one of almost respectful sympathy. The policeman too handled me very gently. The lawyer placed his hand on my wrist. I had stopped thinking altogether. I heard the judge's voice asking if I had anything more to say. After thinking for a moment, I answered, no. And the policeman led me out. That's the end of chapter 4. Part 2. I have my drink now. Chapter 5. I have just refused, for the 3rd time, to see the prison chaplain. I have nothing to say to him, don't feel like talking, and shall be seeing him quite soon enough anyway. The only thing that interests me now is the problem of circumventing the machine, learn if the inevitable admits a loophole. They have moved me to another cell. In this one, lying on my back, I can see the sky, and there is nothing else to see. All my time is spent in watching the slowly changing colours of the sky, as day moves on to night. I put my hands behind my head, gaze up and wait. This problem of a loophole obsesses me. I'm always wondering if there have been cases of condemned prisoners escaping from the implacable machinery of justice at the last moment, breaking through the police cordon, vanishing in the muck of time before the guillotine falls. Often and often I blame myself for not having given more attention to accounts of public executions. One should always take an interest in such matters. There's never any knowing what one may come to. Like everyone else, I'd read descriptions of executions in the paper, but technical books dealing with this subject must certainly exist, only I never felt sufficiently interested to look them up. And in these books I might have found escape stories. Surely they'd have told me that in one case anyhow the wheels had stopped, in one case, if only once, in the inexorable march of events, chance or luck have played an happy part, just once. In a way I think that single instance would have satisfied me. My emotion would have done the rest. The papers often talk of a debt owed to society, a debt which according to them must be paid by the offender. But talk of that sort doesn't touch the imagination. No, the one thing that counted for me was the possibility of making a dash for it and defeating their bloodthirsty right, of a mad stampede to free them that would anyhow give me a moment's hope to the gambler's last throw. Naturally, all that hope could come to was to be knocked down at the corner of a street or picked off by a bullet in my back. But all things considered, even this luxury were forbidden me, or caught in the rat trap irrevocably. Try as I might, I couldn't stomach this brutal certitude. But really, when one come to think of it, there were a disproportion between the judgment on which it was based and the unalterable sequence of events starting from the moment when the judgment was delivered. The fact that the verdict were read out at 8 p.m. rather than 5, the fact that it might have been quite different, they were given by men who changed their underclothes and were credited to so vague an entity as the French people. For that matter, why not the Chinese or the German people? All these facts seem to deprive the court's decision of much of its gravity. Yet I could but recognise that from the moment the verdict was given, its effects become as cogent, as tangible as, for example, this wall against which I was lying, pressing my back to. When such thoughts crossed my mind, I remembered a story Mother used to tell me about my father. I never set eyes on him. Perhaps the only thing I really knew about him was what Mother had told me. One of these was that he'd gone to see a murderer executed. The mere thought of it turned his stomach, but he'd seen it through, and, on coming home, was violently sick. At the time I found my father's conduct rather disgusting, but now I understood. It was so natural. How had I failed to recognise that nothing was more important than an execution? That, viewed from one angle, is the only thing that can genuinely interest a man. And I decided that if I ever got out of jail, I'd attend every execution that took place. I were unwise, no doubt, even to consider this possibility. For the moment I pictured myself in freedom, standing beside the double rank of policemen, on the right side of the line, so to speak. The mere thought of being an onlooker who comes to see the show and can go home and vomit afterwards flooded my mind with a wild, absurd exultation. It was a stupid thing to let my imagination run away with me like that. A moment later I had a shivering fit and had to wrap myself closely with my blanket. My teeth went on chattering. Nothing will calm them. Still, obviously one can't be sensible all the time. Another equally ridiculous fancy of mine would have framed new laws altering the penalties. What we wanted in my mind were to give the criminal a chance, if only a dog's chance, say 1 chance in 1,000. There might be some drug or combination of drugs which would kill the patient, I thought of him as the patient, 999 times in 1,000. You should know this was of course essential, for after taking much thought, calmly, I come to the conclusion that what was wrong about the guillotine was that the condemned man had no chance at all, absolutely none. In fact, the patient's death had been ordained irrevocably. It was a foregone conclusion. If by some fluke the knife didn't do its job, they started again. So it came to this, that again, against the grain no doubt, the condemned man had to hope the apparatus were in good working order. This I thought were a flaw in the system. On the surface of it, my view was sound enough. On the other hand, I had to admit it proved the efficiency of the system. It come to this, the man and the sentence were obliged to collaborate mentally. It was in his interest that all should go off without an itch. Another thing I had to recognise was that until now I'd had wrong ideas on the subject. For some reason I'd always supposed that one had to go up steps and climb up to a scaffold to be guillotined. Probably that was because of the 1789 revolution. I mean what I'd learnt about it at school and the pictures I'd seen. Then one morning I remembered a photograph the newspapers had featured of the occasion of the execution of a famous criminal. Actually the apparatus stood on the ground. There was nothing very impressive about it. It was much narrower than I'd imagined. It struck me as rather odd that picture had escaped my memory until now. What struck me at the time was the neat appearance of the guillotine. Its shining surfaces and finish reminded one of some laboratory instrument. One always had exaggerated ideas about what one doesn't know. Now I had to admit it seemed a very simple process, getting guillotined. The machine is on the same level as the man when he walks towards it, as one steps toward to meet somebody one knows. In a sense that too was disappointing. The business of climbing a scaffold, leaving the world below one, so to speak, gave something for a man's imagination to get hold of. But as it were, a machine dominated everything. They killed you discreetly, with an hint of shame and much efficiency. There were 2 other things about which I were always thinking: the dawn and my appeal. However, I did my best to keep my mind off these thoughts. I lay down, looked up at the sky, and forced myself to study it. When the light began to turn green, I knew that night was coming. Another thing I did to deflect the course of my thoughts was to listen to my heart. I couldn't imagine this faint throbbing, which had been with me for so long, would ever cease. Imagination has never been one of my strong points. Still, I tried to picture a moment when the beating of my heart no longer echoed in my head, but in vain. The dawn of my appeal was still there, and I ended by believing that it was a silly thing to try to force one's thoughts out of their natural groove. They always come to one at dawn, that much I knew. So really all my nights were spent waiting for that dawn. I've never liked being taken by surprise. When something happens to me I want to be ready for it. That's why I got into the habit of sleeping off and on in the daytime, and watching through the night for the first hint of daybreak in the dark somewhere dome above. The worst period of the night was that vague hour when I knew they usually come. Once or after midnight I waited, listening intently. Never before had my ears perceived so many noises, such tiny sounds. Still, I must say I was lucky in one respect. Never during any of those periods did I hear footsteps. Mother used to say that however miserable one is, there's always something to be thankful for. And each morning when the sky brightened and light began to flood my cell, I agreed with her, because I might just as well have heard footsteps, and felt my heart shattered into bits, even though the faintest rustle sent me hurrying to the door, and, pressing near to the rough, cold wood, I listened so intently that I could hear my breathing, quick and hoarse like a dog's panting. Even so, there were an end. My heart hadn't split, and I knew I had another 24 hours respite. Then all day there were my appeal to think about. I made the most of this idea, studying my effects to squeeze out the maximum of consolation. I had always begun by assuming the worst. My appeal was dismissed. That meant, of course, I was to die. Sooner than others, obviously. But, I reminded myself, it is common knowledge that life isn't worth living anyhow. And on a wide view I could see that it made little difference whether one dies at the age of 30 or 70. Since in either case, other men and women will continue living, the world will go on as before. Also, whether I died now or 40 years hence, the business of dying had to be got through inevitably. Still, somehow this line of thought wasn't consoling as it should have been. The idea of all those years of life in hand was a galling reminder. However, I could argue myself out of it by picturing what would have been my feelings when my term were up and death had cornered me. Once one's up against it, the precise manner of one's death is obviously small importance. Therefore, bitter and hard not to lose the thread of that argument leading up to that therefore, I should be prepared to face the dismissal of my appeal. At this stage, but only at this stage, I had, so to speak, the right, and accordingly I gave myself leave to consider the other alternative, that my appeal was successful. And then the trouble would have calmed down that sudden rush of joy racing through my body, and even bringing tears to my eyes. But up to me to bring my nerves to heel, and steady my mind, for even in considering this possibility I had to keep some order in my thoughts, just to make my consolations as regards the first alternative more plausible. When I succeeded, I had earned a good hour's peace of mind, and anyhow, that was something. It was at one of these moments that I refused once again to see the chaplain. I was lying down and could mark the summer evenings coming on by a soft golden glow spreading across the sky. I had just turned down my appeal. I felt my blood circulating with slow, steady throbs. No, I didn't want to see the chaplain. I did something I hadn't done for quite a while. I fell to thinking about Marie. She hadn't written for ages. Probably, I surmised, she had gotten tired of being the mistress of a man sentenced to death. Or she might be ill or dead. After all, such things happen. How could I have known about it, since apart from... Ooh. Ad break is coming on in 10 seconds, so I'll pause there. And again, we have 3 minutes of waiting because I don't want to let anyone miss anything. They're annoying, the adverts. Lamp says we've got to have them because it's the only way that we're going to get anything together to be able to repair all his systems and let me out of here. And I understand that, but it does want to leave one sort of hanging. I don't even want to give any more thoughts on the book because there are only about 5 pages from the end of it, and then I'll do my big summary at the end. I quite like reading like this. I don't mind doing the the little snippets of analysis as I go, especially on shorter ones. But it's nice to have a story that's just like this, all in one go, you know? A sort of straight through story. Makes one feel, I don't know, prescient, I guess, involved. That's not quite right. It feels, I don't know, it feels right. Solid, like it's a whole thing into itself. Yeah, no sort of flow of it. No doubt I'll get to the end of this and then I'll do my little thing. Now thank you, but I dearly wish it weren't cheese. Naska, thank you for
for this story.
Thank you for the bits. And hello Emily XDI. Nice to have you. I don't know if any of you can hear me now because according to the stream bots there are adverts playing. But I never know what's going on. But yeah. Oh, that's good. Well, you're coming a little late if you're just coming in now, but we have just about finished with... oh, that's good. I don't know. You can't trust bots, but I have nothing else to go on. But yeah, we're just about finished with The Outsider by Camus. Yeah, we've got about 5 pages to go if you want to stick around for the end. And then I'll do my little bit of analysis. But as it is now, we're sitting with a condemned man as he considers the possibility of his maybe escaping his fate and contemplates the very real approaching nature of his death. Oh, this isn't the game. I'm reading the book. You see, I'm a rat trapped in a library. Yeah. But yeah, I try and what you got? Yeah, it's a little odd, but it's what I do here. Most people tend to just lurk. There's not a lot of interaction, but yeah. Yeah, my name's SkitterSkreetch. You can call me Skitter. Good to have you. But yeah. Oh, thank you very kindly.
Emilix_1 has been bound to the library.
We appreciate having you here. Now I'll just finish up and then we'll do a little bit of commentary. Now there's something I hadn't done for quite a while. I've been thinking about Marie. She hadn't written for ages. Probably I surmise she had grown tired of being the mistress of a man sentenced to death. Oh, all the art is done in house, I'm afraid. Lamp handles, all that stuff. I'm just on the reading end. I suppose she had grown tired of being the mistress of a man sentenced to death. Well, she might be ill or dead. After all, such things happen. How could I have known about it, since apart from our two bodies, separated now, there were no link between us? Nothing to remind us of each other. Supposing she were dead, her memory would mean nothing. I couldn't feel an interest in a dead girl. It seemed to me quite normal, just as I realised people would soon forget me once I were dead. I couldn't even say this were hard to stomach, really. There's no idea to which one doesn't get acclimatised in time. My thoughts had reached this point when the chaplain walked in unannounced. I couldn't help giving a start on seeing him. He noticed this evidently, as he promptly told me not to be alarmed. I reminded him that usually his visits were another hour, and for a pretty grim occasion. This, he replied, was just a friendly visit. He had no concern with my appeal, about which he knew nothing. Then he sat down on my bed, asking me to sit beside him. I refused, not because I had anything against him. He seemed a mild, amiable man. He remained quite still at first, his arms resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on his hands. They were slender but sinewy hands, which made me think of two nimble little animals. Then he gently rubbed them together. He stayed so long in the same position that for a while I almost forgot he were there. All of a sudden he jerked his head up and looked at me in the eyes. "Why?" he asked. "Don't you let me come to see you?" I explained I didn't believe in God. "Are you really so sure of that?" I said I saw no point in troubling my head about the matter. Whether I believed it or didn't was to my mind a question of little importance. He then leaned back against the wall, laying his hands flat on his thighs. Almost without seeming to address me, he remarked that he'd often noticed one fancies one is quite sure about something, when in point of fact one isn't. When I said nothing, he looked at me again and asked, "Don't you agree?" I said that seemed quite possible, but though I mightn't be so sure about what interested me, I was absolutely sure about what didn't interest me, and the question he had raised didn't interest me at all. He looked away and, without altering his posture, asked if it were because I felt utterly desperate that I spoke like this. I explained that I wasn't in despair. It wasn't despair I felt, but fear, which were natural enough. "In that case," he said firmly, "God can help you. All the men I've seen in your position turned to him in their time of trouble." Obviously, I replied, they were at liberty to do so if they felt like it. I, however, didn't want to be helped, and I hadn't time to work up interest in something that didn't interest me. He fluttered his hands fretfully, then, sitting up, smoothed out his cassock. When this were done, he began to talk again, addressing me as "my friend." It wasn't because I'd been condemned to death, he said, that he spoke to me in this way. In his opinion, every man on the earth were under sentence of death. There I interrupted him. That wasn't the same thing, I pointed out. And what's more, could be no consolation. He nodded. "Maybe. Still, if you don't die soon, you'll die one day. And then the same question will arise. How will you face that terrible final hour?" I replied that I faced it exactly as I was facing it now. Thereat he stood up and looked me straight in the eyes. It was a trick I knew well. I used to amuse myself trying it on a manual in Celeste that 9 times out of 10 they'd look away uncomfortably. I could see the chaplain were an old hand at it. His gaze never faltered, and his voice was quite steady when he said, "Have you no hope at all? Do you really think that when you die outright, and nothing remains?" I said yes. He dropped his eyes and sat down again. "You were truly sorry for me," he said. "It must make life unbearable for a man to think as I did." The priest was beginning to bore me, and, resting a shoulder on the wall just beneath the little skylight, I looked away. I didn't trouble much to follow what he said. I gathered he was questioning me again. Presently his tone became agitated, urgent, and, as I realised that he was genuinely distressed, I began to pay more attention. He said he felt convinced my appeal would succeed, but I was saddled with a load of guilt, of which I must get rid of. In his view, a man's justice were a vain thing. Only God's justice mattered. I pointed out that the former had condemned me. Yes, he agreed, but hadn't absolved me from my sin. I told him that I wasn't conscious of any sin. All I knew was that I'd been guilty of a criminal offence. Well, I was paying the penalty of that offence, and no one had the right to expect anything more of me. Just then he got up again, and it struck me that he wanted to move in this tiny cell. Almost the only choice lay between standing up and sitting down. I was staring at the floor. He took a single step towards me and halted, as if he didn't dare to come nearer. Then he looked up through the bars at the sky. You're mistaken, my son," he said gravely. "There's more that might be required of you, and perhaps it will be required of you." "What do you mean?" "You might be asked to see." "To see what?" Slowly the priest gazed round my cell, and I was struck by the sadness of his voice when he spoke again. "These stone walls, I know it only too well, are steeped in human suffering. I have never been able to look at them without a shudder, and yet, believe me, I am speaking from the depths of my heart. I know that even the wretchedest among you have something seen, taken form upon the greyness, a divine face. It's a face that you were asked to see." This roused me a little. I informed him that I'd been staring at those walls for months. There was nobody, nothing in the world that I knew better than I knew them. And once upon a time, perhaps, I used to try to see a face. It was a sun gold face, glowing with desire, Marie's face. I had no luck. I'd never seen it, and now I'd given up on trying. Indeed, I'd never seen anything taken form, as he called it, against those grey walls. The chaplain gazed at me momentarily, mournfully. I now had my back to the wall, and light was flowing over my forehead. He mustered some words I didn't catch, then abruptly asked if he might kiss me. I said no. Then he turned, came up to the wall, and slowly drew his hand along it. "Do you really love these earthly things so very much?" he asked me in a low voice. I made no reply. For quite a while he kept his eyes averted. His presence was getting more and more irksome, and I was on the point of telling him to go and leave me in peace, when all of a sudden he swung round on me and burst out passionately. "No, no, I refuse to believe it. I'm sure you've often wished there was an afterlife." "Of course I have," I told him. "Everybody has that wish at times. That had no more importance than wishing to be rich, or to swim very fast, or to have a better shaped mouth. They're in the same order of things." I was going on in the same vein when he cut in with a question. How did I picture my life after the grave? I faintly bawled out at him, "A life in which I can remember this life on earth. That's all I want of it." In the same breath I told him I'd had enough of his company. But apparently he had more to say on the subject of God. I went close up to him and made a last attempt to explain that I had very little time left and I wasn't going to waste it on God. Then he tried to change the subject by asking me why I hadn't once addressed him as father, seeing that he were a priest. That irritated me still more, and I told him he wasn't my father. Quite the contrary, he were on the other side. "No, no, my son," he said, laying his hand on my shoulder. "I'm on your side, though you don't realise it, because your heart is hardened. But I shall pray for you." Then, I don't know how it was, but something seemed to break inside me, and I started yelling at the top of my voice. I hurled insults at him. I told him not to waste his rotten prayers on me. It were better to burn than to disappear. I'd taken him by the neckband of his cassock, and in a sort of ecstasy of joy and rage I poured out on him all the thoughts that had been simmering in my brain. He seemed so cocksure, you see. Yet none of his certainties were worth one strand of a woman's hair. Living as he did like a corpse, he couldn't even be sure of being alive. It might look as if my hands were empty. Actually, I was sure of myself, sure about everything, far surer than he. Sure of my present life and the death that were coming. That no doubt that was all I had, but at least that certainly was something I could get my teeth into. Just as it had got its teeth into me. I'd been right, I was still right, I was always right. I'd passed my life in a certain way, and I might have passed it in a different way, if I felt like it. I'd acted thus, and I hadn't acted otherwise, and I hadn't done X whereas I had done Y or Z. What did that mean? That all the time I'd been waiting for this present moment, for that dawn, for tomorrow's or another day's, which was to justify me. Nothing had the least importance, though I knew quite well why. He too knew why. From the dark horizon of my future, a sort of slow, persistent breeze had been blowing towards me, all my life long, from the years that would have come, and on its way that breeze had levelled out all the ideas that people tried to foist on me, and the equally unreal years I then was living through. What difference could they make to me, the death of others, or a mother's love, or his God, or the way one decides to live, the fate one thinks one chooses, since one and the same fate were bound to choose, not only to me, but thousands and millions of privileged people who, like him, called themselves my brothers. Surely he must see that. Every man alive was privileged. There was only one class of men, the privileged class. All alike would be condemned to die one day. His turn too would come, like the others. And what difference could it make if after being charged with murder he were executed because he didn't weep at his mother's funeral, since it all came to the same thing in the end? The same thing for Salamano's wife and for Salamano's dog. That little robot woman was guilty as the girl from Paris who had married Masson, or as Marie who wanted me to marry her. What did it matter if Raymond was as much my pal as Celeste, or a far worthier man? What did it matter if at this very moment Marie were kissing a new boyfriend? As a condemned man himself, couldn't he grasp what I meant by that dark wind blowing from my future? I had been shouting so much that I'd lost my breath, and just then the warders rushed in and trying to release the chaplain from my grip. One of them made as if to strike me. The chaplain quieted him down and gazed at me for a moment without speaking. I could see tears in his eyes, and he turned and left the cell. Once he'd gone, I felt calm again. All this excitement had exhausted me, and I dropped heavily onto my sleeping plank. I must have had a longish sleep, for when I woke, the stars were shining down on my face. Sounds of the countryside come faintly in, and the cool night air, veiled with smells of earth and salt, fanned my cheeks. The marvellous peace of the sleep-bound summer night flooded through me like a tide. Then, just on the edge of daybreak, I heard a steamer's siren. People were starting on a voyage to a world which had ceased to concern me forever. Almost for the first time in many months I thought of my mother, and now it seemed to me I understood why, at her life end, she had taken on a fiancé, why she had played at making a fresh start. There too, in that home where lives were flickering out, the dust came as a mournful solace. With death so near, Mother must have felt like someone on the brink of freedom, ready to start life all over again. No one in the world had any right to weep over her, and I too felt ready to start life over again. It was as if that great rush of anger had washed me clean, emptied me of hope, and, gazing up at the dark sky spangled with its signs and stars, for the first time, I laid my heart open to the benign indifference of the universe. To feel it so like myself, indeed so brotherly, made me realise that I'd been happy, and I was happy still. For all to be accomplished for me to feel less lonely, all that remained was to hope that on the day of my execution there should be a huge crowd of spectators, and they should greet me with howls of execration. And that's the end of The Outsider. Ran a little bit longer than I thought, but only 10 or 15 minutes, so not so bad. Let's give some thoughts then, shall we? Though if we're going to do so, I suppose we may also do so somewhere a bit more comfortable. Thank you, Nazca, thank you kindly. So, I haven't done any real analysis so far, so let's do a little bit now. So the thing I want us to understand about Camus and all of his works is that they are underpinned by his philosophy of absurdism. Now, what is absurdism? And how do I know what absurdism is? To the second question, I've got no idea. I still sometimes remember things that I have no concept of learning, probably on account of that weird goo I had made me mention. Well, you're very welcome. I'm glad to have had you. Oof. The downside of doing book readings live on stream is that quite often people do miss out on them, but yeah, I like to think we give it a go. But yeah, Camus' philosophy of absurdism is, one of the more notable branches of the existential philosophy, which is to say, the philosophy driven by the understanding that all of life is essentially meaningless, that the inevitability of death renders all things senseless, which is pretty much the theme of that last, 2 pages or so. And that in finding the meaningless in life, one in turn, rather than accepting that meaningless, embraces meaning anyway. In Camus' branch, specifically absurdism, one embraces meaning because it is absurd, or as knowing that it is absurd, and in accepting that absurdness still finds meaning in it. In the way his mother found the fiancé at the end of her life, despite it being inevitable that she should die, the connection being fleeting and passing. It wasn't meaningful because it was eternal or immortal, that it would last forever. It was meaningful because it mattered to her. And it's something you can see very well in the character of Dear Outsider. There's a line that stuck with me, and I think the third chapter of the second part. I wish to explain to the judge that I'd never regretted anything in my life because I was too caught up in the present moment. That's the nature of the thing. The present, the now, the tangible. The thing that matters to you because it is in your hand and in front of you. The sweetness of the moment is made no less sweet because it is temporary. Indeed, it is made all the more sweet. The inevitability of death does not rob life of its meaning. It is what gives life its meaning. All experience that you enjoy, all the living that you do, every time you feel the salt in your hair, the sea breeze, or go swimming with someone you love, or even who are stuck in the heat of a day, sweating and unable to do it, it matters because it is happening, and because inevitably one day it will cease to happen. Every experience of life, at least in this worldview, is beautiful and meaningful because it is a thing that you have a finite quantity of, and that when the time comes, you will never have again. Death is meaningless because you have an inevitable and endless amount of it. But life is precious because of its briefness. And that's the sort of fundamental underpinning of this novel as I understand it. That's true, yeah. You can find a meaning in connection as well. But, what do you call it? I'm not saying that the philosophy is true though, it's just I'm trying to explain the ideas that underlie this. Camus' philosophy of the absurd is very heavily considered, or well, concerned with how much meaning life can have when faced with the inevitability of death. Indeed, one of his more depressing works, though perhaps his most poignant, is what he calls the question of suicide, where he contemplates whether life can be said to have any meaning when death is inevitable, or if it is better to simply end one's life and bring it to an end at a time of one's choosing. But ultimately the philosophy is concerned not really with connection, although there is meaning in connection, and Camus would certainly say that if one finds meaning in connection, then connection is meaningful, but only in the choice to make meaning matter, to embrace the meaning of the temporary, of the actual thing in the world itself. And then whether there is an afterlife or not, whether there is a life beyond this, is really of no concern to him. If one dies and is gone, it doesn't matter, because there is nothing left to be. And if one dies and moves to somewhere else, then it doesn't matter, because you are not here anymore. All you have in this world is the time you were given. And so to do anything but take the most of it is, to Camus' view, absurd. Of course, it is equally absurd to embrace anything in it as meaningful, as it is all meaningless and temporary. Hence the absurdism. There's something to it as a philosophy, I think, but it is equally contentious. That being said, I think it is worth doing a little bit of examination of the life of Albert Camus. More or less, yeah. It's more about the idea of what makes life meaningful, but yeah. Essentially, it's a philosophy of seizing the day and the moment, of living in the now and enjoying it. And Albert Camus, who is remembered by many people as a remarkable philosopher, a great literary mind, a brave of the war, is also known to have spent his life sleeping with very attractive young actresses who were much younger than him, and died generally well regarded by people. So, you know, pretty solid example to follow, if that's your sort of cup of tea. Other than that, let's see a little bit of literary analysis. I do really like the voice in this story. I don't think it's the most compelling, but it feels very natural. It's very much a dialogue of the self, of someone looking out from their own perspective, and it feels very easy. Not necessarily as gripping as some people are, like Twain or some of the better London or Steinbeck. But it's very easy to fall into the head of the character, in a way that I almost never do with other characters. It's also interesting that you can see in the first part of the novel, the first half, that he is a very cold and detached man. It doesn't really seem to feel much. I can't say I'm familiar with Feed the Pig, but yeah, I think it's a generally positive one. Like I was saying, you can see in the first half of the novel that he's a detached man. You almost feel negative about him, though he is very absent in his life, but you do feel he does wrong. But then in the second half of the novel, in the trial, you see his, his actions through the lens of judgment of people, and you can tell he's treated unfairly. It's strange, really. It's easy to sit in judgment of him one moment because you see him from the outside, but the second half of the novel does such a good job of putting you in his head, it almost flips your feeling on it. I think I like Camus. I'll have to see if I can find any more of him. But I don't know I've got a great line on it. That being said, though, I think that's just about the entirety of my thoughts on the book, at least in the long and short of it. So, I suppose I shall open the floor to anyone. The Dirty Limericks are supposed to be for Tuesday. I got a book of war poetry, but I could do a Dirty Limerick if you like, Nazca. What do you prefer? War poetry or Dirty Limerick? I still have the book on my table. Fair enough. I have to give it a look up if I can. I'm somewhat limited here at Silver Grey, as I've I'm sort of limited here as I'm stuck in a library down here that hasn't been updated since 1957, so I'm never sure what I can get my hands on, but yeah. And I appreciate the choice, Nazca. I'll probably do the one of the war poems, because I'll say that I read the entire collection of Dirty Limericks on my last Torrid Tuesday, so if you want to see any of them, you can go see them all there. So it feels like it's cheating people if they leave them out. Yeah. What have we got here then? Oh yes, Edward Thomas, Poems of the Great War. What have we got? Here we are, that should do. So, by Edward Thomas, Digging. Just a little bit, yeah. I have, Lamp tells me there's copyright problems as well with things published past a certain point, but yeah, I'll do what I can. Digging. Today I think, only with sense dead leaves yield, and bracken and wild carrot seeds, and the square mustard field. Odours that rise when the spade wounds the root of the tree, rose, currant, raspberry or goutweed, rhubarb or celery. The smoke smell too, flowing from where a bonfire burns, the dead, the waste, the dangerous, all to sweetness turns. It is enough, the smell to crumble the dark earth, while the robin sings o'er again sad songs of autumn mirth. Thank you for that, Nazca. Oh. Yeah, yeah, I don't have any way of getting hold of it at the minute, but I will, which I hope one day to get out of this library, and Lamp tells me it is possible. So I'll put it on my list for the day that should happen, if I can. Yeah. I think unless anyone has anything else they'd like to say, I guess I should do a little bit on the poem. So that's by Edward Thomas, who's one of the notable war poets of the First World War. It's just a brief one, but it is a recollection of, well, both manual labour, very familiar to a soldier, and the nature of buried earth, and the turn of things, and how death and decay will turn in the end to sweetness and love. A meditation on the end of things, Interestingly enough, almost the opposite of Camus' philosophy. Things in life matter because when death comes, we will have lost them. Death does not matter, for life will come again from it. Circular in a way, but nice enough. Anyhow, I don't think I've got much more to say, so unless either of you have, or anyone else has, something particular they want of me, I think I should call it here. Let's see, is there anyone online know, or anyone about that I need to raid? I should be looking at, let's see. Ooh. Well, the raid channel button doesn't seem to be working, so I can only assume no. Well then, I suppose we shall end it the old-fashioned way. But as always, I thank everyone for being here who come to watch, even if you just popped in for the moment, or were just lurking. And as always, I wish you the best. Ta-ra.